Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. There is a woman who sat on the throne of England for 45 years, who never married, never named her heir, survived plots, invasions, executions, and the collapse of everything she loved, and who did it all while being told repeatedly by nearly every man around her that she was not capable of doing any of it. Tonight we're going to follow her from the moment she was born into danger, through every crisis that should have destroyed her, all the way to the quiet room where she finally lay down and let go. Dim the lights, settle in. This one is worth staying awake for, though of course you won't. A Dangerous Birth. The story of Elizabeth Tudor does not begin with triumph. It does not begin with fanfare or with the kind of golden opening that later legends would prefer. It begins in failure, or at least that is how the people around her experienced it. On the 7th of September 1533 in the Palace of Greenwich, a child was born to King Henry VIII of England and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. The child was healthy. The child was strong. The child was, unfortunately for everyone involved, a girl. Henry had wanted a boy with a ferocity that is difficult to overstate. He had spent years dismantling his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, had broken with the Pope in Rome, had dragged England into religious and political convulsion, had risked war with Spain, had humiliated a loyal and dignified queen, and had done all of it in the pursuit of a male heir. The astrologers had predicted a boy. The physicians had predicted a boy. The letters announcing the birth had already been prepared using the word prince. Someone had to go back and add an awkward letterus to the word before they were sent out. The celebration that had been planned was quietly scaled back. The jousting tournament that was supposed to mark the birth of England's new prince was cancelled. The announcement of the birth was made with noticeably less fanfare than the occasion demanded, and the little girl who had just arrived in the world, red-faced and furious in the way that all newborns are, had no idea yet how inconvenient her existence was considered. She was named Elizabeth, after both her grandmothers, Elizabeth of York on her father's side, Elizabeth Howard on her mother's. It was a good name, a strong name. She would eventually make it the most famous name in the English language, but nobody standing in that room on that September morning could have known that. What they knew was that Henry was disappointed, that Anne's position had just become considerably more precarious, and that the infant in the cradle had entered a world that was already arranging itself against her. To understand what Elizabeth was born into, you have to understand what her father was. Henry V is one of those historical figures so enormous, so theatrical in his appetites and his rages, that it can be tempting to flatten him into caricature. The fat king with the wives and the turkey leg. But the Henry who stood in the corridors of Greenwich Palace in 1533 was not yet the bloated tyrant of his later years. He was 42 years old, still physically impressive, still charming when he chose to be, and utterly, completely certain that his will was the same thing as God's will. He had proved this to his own satisfaction by breaking with Rome. If the Pope would not give him what he wanted, he would simply decide that the Pope did not have the authority to give or withhold anything. The logic was circular and magnificent and terrifying, and it shaped every room Elizabeth would ever grow up in. Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother, was a more complicated figure than later portraits suggest. She was not the scheming seductress of Catholic propaganda, but she was not the Protestant martyr of Protestant propaganda either. She was a woman of genuine intelligence, strong opinions, and real political instinct, which in the court of Henry VIII was almost as dangerous as being born female. She had waited years for Henry, had refused to become his mistress when the easier path would have been to simply give him what he wanted and accept the consequences. She had held out for marriage and for the crown, and she had won both. But winning in Henry's court was rarely permanent. After Elizabeth's birth, Anne became pregnant again, and the pregnancies failed. A son born dead in 1534, another pregnancy lost in 1536. With each failure, Henry's patience contracted. His eye had already begun to move toward a quieter, gentler woman at court, a lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour, who had the enormous political advantage of being nothing at all like Anne. The charges that were eventually brought against Anne Boleyn in the spring of 1536 were almost certainly fabricated. Adultery, incest, treason. The evidence was thin to the point of transparency. The trials rushed, the outcome predetermined. But Henry wanted his freedom, and in Henry's England what Henry wanted had a way of becoming legally inevitable. Anne was arrested. She was taken to the Tower of London through the same gate by which she had entered in triumph 3 years before. She conducted herself in the Tower with a dignity that impressed even those who were not her friends. She wept sometimes, and laughed sometimes, and sometimes both at once, which suggests she understood exactly what was happening and found it somewhere between horrifying and absurd. She was executed on the 19th of May, 1536. She was probably 35 years old, though the records are uncertain. She wore a dark gown and a French hood, and gave a brief speech from the scaffold that managed to be gracious without being either grovelling or accusatory. It was, even in that terrible moment, a performance. She had learned, as her daughter would learn, that in the court of Henry VIII everything was a performance, and the audience was always watching. Elizabeth was 2 years old when her mother died. She was old enough to walk, old enough to have begun to form words, probably not old enough to understand what had happened, though the absence of her mother would have been real and bewildering in the way that absences are real, and bewildering to small children even when they cannot articulate them. Within 11 days of Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour. 11 days. History does not always wait for grief to finish. What did this birth, this death, this particular family situation do to the infant Elizabeth? We cannot know with certainty what a 2-year-old absorbs or understands, but we do know what the world she grew up in looked like. It was a world in which love and favour could be withdrawn overnight, in which the person who was everything to you on Tuesday could be declared a traitor by Thursday, in which the safest thing to do was to watch and wait and say nothing that could not be unsaid. Elizabeth would become extraordinarily good at all 3 of those things, so good that her advisers would sometimes want to shake her, her parliament would beg and petition and argue, and her suitors would go home baffled and empty-handed. She learned to hold her cards so close to her chest that most people were never entirely sure she had any cards at all. The lessons of her birth were not taught in a schoolroom. They were taught by circumstance, by the specific and terrible nature of the family she had been born into. She was the daughter of a king who viewed the world as something to be bent to his will, and of a woman who had tried to play that same court by its own rules and had lost everything. Elizabeth would spend the rest of her life finding a third way. Not submission, not confrontation, something more slippery and more durable than either. But all of that came later. In September 1533 she was simply a baby in a cradle in Greenwich, red and new and already, without knowing it, in danger. The court moved around her, Henry made plans for new marriages and new heirs, and the little girl who would one day call herself the Virgin Queen looked out at the world with the unfocused gaze of the very newly arrived. She had arrived, as it turned out, exactly on time, though it would take everyone else several decades to realise it. The king's inconvenient daughter. In the months after Elizabeth's birth, the court arranged itself around the business of deciding what she was. The question sounds simple. She was the king's daughter. But in the Tudor world, the category of king's daughter came with extraordinary complications, and Elizabeth would spend much of her early childhood navigating them. Her older half-sister Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, had been declared illegitimate when Henry annulled his first marriage. Mary had spent years refusing to accept this verdict with a stubbornness that must have both infuriated and secretly impressed her father, since stubbornness was a quality Henry recognised and occasionally respected. When Elizabeth was born, Mary's illegitimacy was confirmed, and the infant Elizabeth was positioned as the legitimate heir, the real princess, the one who mattered. The household that had belonged to Mary was effectively dissolved and rebuilt around the new baby. Mary, who was 17, was required to serve in her infant half-sister's household. She found this humiliating, which it was designed to be, and then 3 years later everything reversed. Anne Boleyn was executed. Elizabeth was declared illegitimate, the product of an invalid marriage. Mary was quietly rehabilitated. Though she was required to acknowledge the royal supremacy and her own mother's marriage's invalidity, which she did with gritted teeth and a guilty conscience that tormented her for the rest of her life. Both girls were now technically bastards. Both girls were now officially not in line for the throne. Both girls were being raised in the English countryside in households that were comfortable enough, but carefully positioned away from the centre of power. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the sheer administrative absurdity of the Tudor succession in this period. Henry had one son, Edward, born to Jane Seymour in 1537, who died 12 days after the birth from complications of what was most likely childbed fever. Edward was real and legitimate and unambiguously male, and therefore the thing Henry had wanted all along. But Henry also had these 2 daughters, both declared illegitimate, both technically without legal claim, both being kept in a kind of dynastic limbo that nobody had quite figured out how to resolve. The Act of Succession of 1544 eventually restored both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession, after Edward, in that order, while leaving their technical illegitimacy intact. This was logically incoherent but politically useful, and the Tudors were nothing if not pragmatic about incoherence when it served their purposes. Elizabeth's early childhood was spent largely at Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, which would become one of the great constants of her life. She was given her own household appropriate to her rank, such as it was, and placed in the care of governesses and later tutors. Her first governess was a woman named Catherine Champernowne, who later became Catherine Ashley after her marriage, and who would remain one of the most important figures in Elizabeth's life for decades. Cat Ashley, as she was known, was warm and affectionate and occasionally unwise and devoted to Elizabeth, with a completeness that the child, given everything she had lost, must have found both comforting and essential. Henry himself was not a constant presence in his daughter's childhood. He visited occasionally, and when he did, accounts suggest he was genuinely fond of the little girl, who was apparently charming and sharp and had the red hair that ran through the Tudor line like a thread. But he had other things to think about. He married Catherine Howard in 1540 and had her executed in 1542. He married Catherine Parr in 1543. He was running a kingdom, conducting foreign policy, managing religious reformation, and getting steadily larger and more painful in the leg wound that would eventually contribute to his death. Elizabeth was a small red-haired girl in Hertfordshire, and he had bigger things on his mind. What this meant in practice was that Elizabeth grew up without parents in any meaningful sense. Her mother was dead. Her father was distant and terrifying and unpredictable, in the way that very powerful people are always at least slightly terrifying to children. What she had instead was a household, a governess, and eventually a series of tutors who would change her life in ways that Henry never managed to. The world Elizabeth inhabited in these years was not an unhappy one in the ordinary physical sense. Hatfield was a fine house. There was food, warmth, education, companionship. She was a royal child, even an inconveniently ranked one, and she was treated accordingly. But there was always the underlying uncertainty, the sense that her position depended on her father's continued favour, and that his favour was a volatile and directional thing like weather, not something you could plan around with any confidence. Henry VIII died on the 28th of January, 1547. He was 55 years old, which sounds young until you remember the trajectory of the last 20 years of his life. He had been enormous, immobile, in pain, increasingly paranoid, and governed by an ego so large it had long since outgrown the body trying to contain it. By the end, he was being carried from room to room. His leg wound was infected and possibly gangrenous. He could no longer walk any meaningful distance. The king, who had been the physical ideal of English Renaissance manhood, tall and athletic and golden in his youth, had become something so different that it was hard to connect the beginning and the end of the same life. Elizabeth was 13 years old when her father died. She had been summoned to court the previous year and had formed something that might be called a family, or at least a version of one, with her stepmother Catherine Parr, who was kind and intellectually lively and seems to have genuinely cared for both of Henry's daughters. Catherine brought the three children, Edward, Mary and Elizabeth, together with something approaching warmth, and actually managed to convince Henry to restore them to his affection and his will in the final years of his life. When Henry died, Elizabeth cried. We know this because it was reported. Whether the tears were for the man himself or for what his death meant, the sudden exposure of a child without the protection of an overwhelming paternal presence is impossible to say with certainty, probably both. Henry was not a good father in any conventional sense, but he was enormous, and the world had organised itself around him, and without him the world was suddenly much less certain. Edward was 9 years old and became Edward VI. The realm was governed by a protectorate, a council of powerful men who would manage things until the boy king was old enough to manage them himself. The most powerful of these men was Edward Seymour, the new king's uncle, who styled himself Lord Protector, and alongside him, circling, ambitious and deeply unscrupulous, was his younger brother Thomas Seymour. Elizabeth was about to have a very difficult few years, but before we get to that, it is worth sitting for a moment with the Elizabeth of this period. 13 years old, red hair, quick eyes, already by all accounts extraordinarily sharp. She had grown up in a court where saying the wrong thing could end in disaster, where love could be declared and withdrawn with terrifying speed, where her own existence had been officially described as both legitimate and illegitimate depending on who was asking and what year it was. She had watched 2 of her stepmothers die, one executed and one in childbirth, though Catherine Parr was still alive. She had watched her father reshape the entire religious and political landscape of England, according to his own desires and convenience. She had learned, in those 13 years, things that no schoolroom could have taught her. She had learned that power was real, and that the absence of it was also real, and that the distance between having it and losing it was not always as large as you hoped. She had learned that silence was often safer than speech. She had learned that survival was not passive, that it required active and continuous effort, the kind of effort that looked like nothing from the outside. She was 13, and her father was dead, and the court was full of ambitious men eyeing each other and eyeing her, and the world was about to become significantly more complicated. She was ready for it, more or less. Or at least she was more ready than anyone around her realized, which, as it turned out, was exactly how she needed to be. The girl who studied like her life depended on it. Here is something worth understanding about the education of Elizabeth Tudor, because it matters more than it might initially appear. In the 16th century, the education of girls was not a priority in any systematic sense. Girls of noble families might learn to read, to manage a household, perhaps to play music or embroider. They might absorb French or some basic literacy in Latin if they were lucky enough to have a father or brother who thought it worth the effort. What they were not generally expected to do was study rhetoric, philosophy, theology, classical history, multiple languages, and the art of argumentation in the way that a boy preparing for a serious life in politics or the church might study them. Elizabeth studied all of those things. She studied them with an intensity and a consistency that produced, by the time she was in her mid-teens, one of the most genuinely educated minds in England. Not the most educated mind of a girl her age, one of the most educated minds of anyone of any age or any gender, and this was not an accident. It was, in the most literal sense, a survival strategy. Let us begin with the tutors, because the tutors were extraordinary. Elizabeth's formal education began in earnest during the reign of her brother Edward, under the supervision of Catherine Parr, who believed genuinely and ahead of her time that the girls under her care deserved serious intellectual formation. The first great figure in Elizabeth's education was William Grindal, a student of the most famous English humanist educator of the age, Roger Ascham. Grindal was a gifted teacher, gentle and encouraging, and Elizabeth thrived under him. When Grindal died of plague in 1548, it was Ascham himself who took over. Roger Ascham deserves a moment of proper attention because he was remarkable. He had written a book on archery, which is a more interesting achievement than it might initially sound, because the book was as much about learning and self-discipline as it was about shooting things with arrows. He would later write a famous educational treatise called The Schoolmaster, which argued against harsh and punishing methods of education in favour of making learning pleasurable and building on a student's natural curiosity. He was, by the standards of his age, a progressive educator, and he thought Elizabeth was extraordinary. The method Ascham used was called double translation. A student would translate a passage from Latin into English, then put the English aside and translate it back into Latin from memory, then compare the result with the original. It sounds dry, but what it actually taught was precision, an attentiveness to the exact meaning of words, an understanding that the same idea could be expressed in multiple ways, and that the choice between those ways was never accidental. Elizabeth learned Latin this way, and it was perhaps the most important intellectual tool she ever acquired, because the ability to understand precisely what words mean, and precisely what they do not mean, is the foundation of every kind of negotiation and every kind of political survival. She learned Greek as well. Her Greek was considered excellent. She also had French, Italian, and Spanish to varying degrees of fluency. By the time she was in her mid-teens, she was writing letters in Latin for her own pleasure, or at least for practice, and translating religious texts from Latin and French and Italian. She translated Margaret of Navarre's Mirror of the Sinful Soul as a gift for Catherine Parr when she was 11 years old. 11. The gift copy, which survives, was embroidered by Elizabeth herself with a cover of blue cloth. She was showing off a little, which is entirely charming, and suggests that underneath the careful exterior was a child who genuinely wanted to be seen for what she could do. Her handwriting in these early years was already remarkable. The italic script she favoured was fashionable, and she executed it with a beauty that went beyond fashion into something like art. Later, when she became queen, the handwriting would become more idiosyncratic, faster, spikier, the natural evolution of a hand that spent decades signing documents and writing letters. But in her teenage years it was gorgeous, the handwriting of someone who took pride in the physical act of writing as much as in the content of what was being written. What did all this studying do to Elizabeth? This is the more interesting question. What does it mean for a person's inner life and outer capacities to have spent the most intellectually formative years of their life reading Cicero and Livy and the Church Fathers and classical history and contemporary theology? A few things, I think. It gave her a frame for understanding power. The classical texts she read were full of discussions of how rulers ought to behave, how they acquired and maintained authority, what virtues were required and what vices were dangerous. These were not abstract debates for Elizabeth. They were immediately applicable to the world she lived in. A world in which the misuse of power had already killed her mother and would kill several of her stepmothers and would come very close to killing her. Reading about tyranny when your father is a tyrant gives the reading a particular urgency. It gave her a gift for language that would serve her for the rest of her life. Elizabeth's speeches are among the greatest in the English language, not because they were composed by someone else and delivered by a figurehead, but because she wrote them herself in her own voice, with a command of rhetoric that was the direct product of years of careful study. The speech she gave at Tilbury before the Spanish Armada, the addresses to her parliament, the letters she composed to foreign monarchs, all of these bear the marks of someone who understood exactly what words were doing and exactly how to make them do more. This was not a natural gift, or not only a natural gift. It was a practiced skill, learned through years of double translation and careful reading. It also gave her, perhaps most importantly, a self. In a childhood defined by instability, by the withdrawal of parents and status and affection, her mind was the one thing that remained consistently hers. Her Latin did not change when her legitimacy changed. Her understanding of rhetoric did not shift when her father's favour shifted. The education was a kind of interior architecture, a structure built inside her that could not be confiscated or declared void by an Act of Parliament. There is a letter she wrote to Catherine Parr in 1544 when she was 11 about her translation work. The letter is in Italian, and it is charming and confident, and already shows the characteristic Elizabeth voice, the voice that is warm and precise and slightly formal and always slightly watchful about the impression it is making. She writes about her studies with a genuine enthusiasm that is not performative. She liked learning. She found it genuinely pleasurable. This is not always true of people who become very good at something, but it was true of Elizabeth, and it meant that she continued reading and studying and thinking for the rest of her life, long after anyone could have required her to. She also liked music. She played the lute and the virginals to a standard that was considered genuinely impressive by people who were in a position to know the difference between impressive and politely impressive. She danced well. She had, underneath the seriousness, a capacity for pleasure and for laughter that broke through in the accounts of people who knew her well. She could be sharp and funny and given to teasing, though the teasing had an edge to it that occasionally drew blood without the victim quite realizing what had happened until afterward. And she read constantly, not just for study, but for pleasure, history above all. She was fascinated by precedent, by what had happened before, by the patterns that repeated themselves in the careers of rulers and the outcomes of states. This was not mere antiquarian interest. It was, again, immediately applicable. She was going to have to navigate a world of powerful men who would try to control her, and the more examples she could find of people who had faced analogous situations, the better equipped she would be to find her way through. The education of Elizabeth Tudor was, in the end, one of the great fortunate accidents of history. She happened to be born at a moment when humanist educational ideals were taking hold in English court circles, happened to come under the influence of exceptional tutors, happened to have a stepmother who valued her mind, and happened to have the intelligence and the drive to make use of all of it. A different girl in the same circumstances might have received the same education and done something more ordinary with it. Elizabeth made it into the foundation of a reign, but the education did not happen in a vacuum. While Elizabeth was studying Cicero, the world around her was becoming more dangerous. Her brother Edward was on the throne, and his uncle Thomas Seymour was noticing that the king's sister was growing up, and that the king's sister had interesting political possibilities, and that the king's sister was living in his household. The lessons that came next were not from any book. The Seymour scandal. This chapter is uncomfortable to write because it is uncomfortable history, and the discomfort is not incidental, it is part of the point. What happened to Elizabeth in 1547 and 1548 involves a man in a position of authority behaving toward a teenage girl in ways that were, by any reasonable standard, predatory, and it very nearly destroyed her. The fact that it did not destroy her tells us something important, not about any weakness in her, but about the specific and unusual nature of her resilience. Thomas Seymour was the younger brother of the Lord Protector Edward Seymour, and he was the kind of man who made his contemporaries nervous even when they were impressed by him. He was handsome and charming and bold and reckless, the sort of person who generates excitement in a room and then generates disaster shortly afterward. He was ambitious in a straightforward, barely concealed way that was both his appeal and his eventual undoing. He wanted power. He was willing to pursue it through any available avenue, and he was not particularly careful about the avenues he chose. In the immediate aftermath of Henry VIII's death, Thomas Seymour moved quickly on two fronts. He proposed marriage to Elizabeth, which was refused, because Elizabeth was third in line to the throne, and her marrying anyone without the council's permission would have been politically explosive. Then he moved on to Catherine Parr, the Dowager Queen, with whom he had apparently had some understanding before Henry appropriated her as wife number 6. He married Catherine Parr in secret, very quickly after Henry's death, which caused a minor scandal but nothing worse. Elizabeth went to live with Catherine Parr and Thomas Seymour in Chelsea, which was where the trouble began. What followed has been discussed and debated by historians for centuries, and it is important to be precise about what we know and what we don't. What we know is that Thomas Seymour engaged in a pattern of behaviour toward Elizabeth that was, at minimum, grossly inappropriate and almost certainly deliberately calculated. He entered her bedchamber in the mornings before she was fully dressed, pulling back the bed curtains, tickling her, slapping her on the back or her buttocks. He engaged in what today we would call grooming behaviour, and he did so with the apparent knowledge and sometimes the participation of Catherine Parr, who may have believed it was harmless teasing, or who may have been trying to neutralise a dynamic she could sense but not quite confront. Elizabeth's response to all of this is revealing. She began rising earlier to be dressed and at her books before Seymour could catch her undressed. She tried to remove herself from situations where she was alone with him. When Catherine Parr died in September 1548, shortly after childbirth, and Seymour almost immediately renewed his pursuit of Elizabeth, now 14 and no longer sheltered by Catherine's presence, Elizabeth's responses become more pointed. When he sent her messages, she answered through intermediaries. When he sent letters, she replied in terms that were polite but non-committal. When his plans became clear enough to constitute a real danger, she stopped writing to him at all. Here is the truly remarkable thing. When Seymour was arrested in January 1549, on charges that included, among other things, allegations that he had been scheming to marry Elizabeth without council permission, the interrogations that followed put Elizabeth herself in serious danger. Her governess Cat Ashley was arrested and interrogated. Her household was gone through. She herself was questioned repeatedly by Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, a skilled interrogator sent by the Protectorate to find evidence against her. Tyrwhitt was convinced she was hiding something. He was probably right. He never got it out of her. She was 15 years old, and she was being interrogated about potentially treasonous conduct, and she held together under the questioning with a composure that Tyrwhitt found both admirable and maddening. She admitted to some things, the things that were already known and could not be denied, and she denied the things that could not be proven. She wrote a carefully constructed letter to the Protector himself, Edward Seymour, which managed to acknowledge the awkwardness of her situation, while firmly asserting her innocence of any serious wrongdoing. The letter is a masterpiece of self-presentation, at once vulnerable enough to seem genuine and controlled enough to give nothing away. She was 15. She was writing it under duress. And it worked. Thomas Seymour was executed in March 1549. Elizabeth, according to one account, received the news with the remark that he was a man of much wit and very little judgment, which is either cold or wise or both, and probably both. She had survived. Cat Ashley was eventually released. Elizabeth withdrew to Hatfield and resumed her studies and conducted herself with a conspicuous propriety that was clearly deliberate. She dressed simply. She wore no jewellery or elaborate decoration. She was seen to be virtuous and modest and focused on her books, which was exactly the image she needed to project and which she projected with considerable skill. What did this episode do to Elizabeth? Again, we cannot be entirely certain, but we can observe the after effects. She was, from this point forward, extremely alert to situations in which men used warmth and familiarity, an apparent affection, as tools of access and manipulation. She was alert to the way that physical attractiveness and charm could be deployed strategically, and she was alert above all to the specific danger of being a young woman with royal blood in a world full of ambitious men who saw her as a route to power rather than as a person. None of this made her cold or closed. She was capable of deep attachment, as the later years of her life would show, but it gave her a wariness, a refusal to let her guard down completely in any romantic or personal context that would shape the rest of her life. And here is the thing about the Seymour scandal that I find most striking when I think about it. Elizabeth was the victim of predatory behaviour by a powerful man. She was then interrogated as though she were the guilty party. She was put in a position where she had to defend herself against implied charges of having encouraged or participated in something that had been done to her, and she navigated all of it, at 15, without losing either her freedom or her dignity. She emerged from it with her reputation, if anything, enhanced, because her subsequent display of Protestant virtue and studious modesty was so well executed that it actually strengthened her public image. She turned a situation designed to destroy her into one that subtly elevated her. She did not do this by accident. She did it by understanding, with a clarity unusual in a 15-year-old, exactly what the situation required and then providing it. It was, in miniature, exactly what she would do for the rest of her life. Living through Bloody Mary. Edward VI died on the 6th of July, 1553. He was 15 years old. The illness was probably tuberculosis, that slow and patient thief that took so many young people in the 16th century, and it had been taking him for months before it finally finished the work. He had been king since the age of 9, a serious and genuinely Protestant child who had been managed with varying degrees of competence and self-interest by first one uncle and then another, and who died without ever quite getting to be the king he might have become if the body had cooperated with the ambition. He left no direct heirs. His death threw the succession into crisis. The person who was legally next was Mary, Henry's eldest daughter. She was 37 years old, Catholic to her bones, and determined in the way that people are determined when they have spent decades being told they are wrong about everything and have refused, at considerable personal cost, to agree. Mary had endured humiliation upon humiliation during her father's reign and her brother's. She had been declared illegitimate, pressured to renounce her faith, required to accept the degradation of her mother's marriage as invalid. She had declined all of it consistently, stubbornly, at a cost to her health and her peace of mind that showed in her face. Now the wheel had turned. She was queen. Elizabeth was next in line after Mary, which was not a comfortable place to be. The years of Mary's reign run from 1553 to 1558, and they are remembered, above almost everything else, for the burnings. Mary restored Catholicism to England, which was her genuine conviction and her legal right as monarch, and she pursued Protestant heresy with a relentlessness that entered popular memory as Bloody Mary and has not quite left it since. Nearly 300 people were burned during her 5 years: bishops, scholars, tradespeople. The most famous was Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury under Henry and Edward, the man who had effectively written the Protestant Church into existence in England. He was burned at Oxford in 1556. The story that attached itself to his death, of him thrusting into the flames the hand that had signed a recantation, became one of the defining images of the Protestant martyrological tradition. Elizabeth was not burned, but her survival was not guaranteed, and the years of navigating Mary's reign were among the most demanding of her life. The problem was structural. Elizabeth was widely understood to be Protestant, which in Mary's England was legally equivalent to being Protestant. She was also next in line to the throne, which meant that every Protestant dissident who dreamed of overthrowing the Catholic Queen had an obvious figurehead. She did not need to do anything treasonous to be dangerous. She simply needed to exist. When the Wyatt Rebellion of 1554 connected her name to an attempted uprising against Mary, even through the flimsiest thread of association, the consequences were immediate. She was summoned to London. She arrived sick, or appearing sick, and the ambiguity of that distinction is entirely characteristic. She was questioned about the rebels. She denied contact with them. She was sent to the Tower on the 18th of February 1554. She entered through Traitor's Gate, the water entrance used for prisoners, and when she reached the stairs inside, she sat down and refused to go further. It is one of the great theatrical moments of her life, and it was calculated as her great theatrical moments always were. She was frightened and exhausted and possibly genuinely unable to move. but she also understood that this moment would be observed and reported, and so she made it visible. She said to no one in particular and to everyone within earshot that she knew her right well enough and was no traitor. Then she went inside. The Tower was where her mother had been held before her execution. Elizabeth knew exactly what it meant. She spent roughly 2 months there, cooperative under questioning, careful in her letters, revealing nothing that could be used against her. She wrote to Mary directly, in a letter that combined genuine appeal with firm assertion of innocence, and she asked for a personal audience with the Queen, which was denied. But the request itself was a political move. It placed Mary in the position of refusing to speak to her own sister. She was eventually released to house arrest at Woodstock in Oxfordshire, under the supervision of Sir Henry Bedingfield, who was decent and honest and therefore impossible to manipulate, which was in some ways more frustrating than a corrupt jailer would have been. Her correspondence was monitored, her movements were restricted. She read, she studied, she scratched verses on a window with a diamond ring. One of them ran something like, "Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be," defiant or melancholy or both. She was eventually permitted to return to Hatfield, and she spent the remaining years of Mary's reign being as invisible as a red-haired Protestant princess with a claim to the throne could reasonably manage to be. She attended Mass. She made no public statements about her beliefs. She contacted no one who could get her killed. She watched. What she watched was a reign coming apart. Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain had produced no heir. Philip was mostly elsewhere, using England as a strategic asset rather than a home. The burnings were producing martyrs rather than converts, and martyrs are notoriously difficult to suppress by burning them because burning creates the story, and the story is the thing that lasts. Mary's health was deteriorating. Calais, the last English territory in France, was lost in January 1558. She died in November of the same year, of what was probably cancer, without her husband beside her, and without the Catholic England she had tried to build. She named Elizabeth her heir because there was no one else. At Hatfield the news arrived. Elizabeth was 25 years old. She had survived her mother's death, her own near destruction, the Tower, Woodstock, 5 years of exhausting compliance with a regime that had genuinely wanted her gone. The most famous account places her under an oak tree in the park reading, "When the delegation came." She spoke in Latin, a verse from the Psalms. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes." Then she stood up and went inside. She was queen. The work was just beginning. The morning she became queen. The 17th of November, 1558, is one of those dates that has a strong claim to being the most consequential day in Elizabethan history, which is perhaps stating the obvious given that it is the day Elizabeth became Elizabeth I. But what is sometimes underappreciated is the scale of the problem she had just inherited, which was considerable, and the speed with which she moved to address it, which was remarkable. Let us first acknowledge the atmosphere of the moment. England in November 1558 was not in good shape. The country had spent 5 years under a Catholic queen who had tried to reverse the Protestant reforms of her father and brother and had succeeded in creating martyrs rather than converts. The relationship with Rome had been restored and then would need to be severed again. The treasury was depleted. Calais was lost. England had been dragged into Philip of Spain's war with France and had come out of it worse than it went in. The harvest had been poor. Influenza was killing people across the country. The church was in disarray. The political class was divided, and the question of what England actually was, Catholic or Protestant, traditional or reformed, had not been definitively answered. The woman who arrived to answer these questions was 25 years old, had spent most of her life either in danger or in inconvenient proximity to danger, had never governed anything larger than her own household, and was being told by the dominant political theory of her age that she was not naturally suited to governance because she was female. John Knox had published his enormously tactless treatise The First Blast of the Trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women the previous year, which argued that female rule was an abomination against nature and God. He had meant it primarily against Mary of Scotland and Mary of England, but he had published it in the year Elizabeth came to the throne, which meant she spent the first weeks of her reign receiving the political equivalent of a very loud and very public declaration that she had no business being there. She was, one imagines, unamused. She did not spend much time being unamused, however, because she did not have time. The first business of a new reign is always appointments. the choosing of the people who will actually run things, and Elizabeth approached this with a precision that suggests she had been thinking about it for some time. She was, after all, a woman who had spent years studying precedent and history and the careers of rulers. She had thought about what she would do when the moment came. The most important appointment she made in those first days was William Cecil, whom she named Principal Secretary. Cecil was 38 years old, a Protestant with a Protestant's convictions and an administrator's precision. He had served in government under both Henry and Edward, had managed to survive Mary's reign by a combination of quiet conformity and careful withdrawal from too prominent a role. He was not glamorous, he was not exciting. He was exactly what Elizabeth needed, a man of exceptional competence and genuine loyalty to England rather than to any particular faction, who would serve her and work alongside her, and occasionally drive her to distraction and be indispensable for the next 4 decades. Elizabeth told him, when she appointed him, that she required of him honest counsel, not flattery. She told him to give her his opinion as a man rather than as a courtier. She told him that if he ever discovered she was being misled or deceived, she expected him to tell her. This speech is documented more or less in Cecil's own notes. It is the kind of speech that a young queen makes on the first day and then sometimes forgets about for the next 40 years. Elizabeth remarkably more or less kept to it. Her relationship with Cecil was not always easy. They disagreed profoundly on some of the most important questions of the reign. But it was honest in the sense that she actually wanted his real opinion, even when she was going to ignore it, which she often was. She was crowned on the 15th of January, 1559 at Westminster Abbey. The weather was fine, unusually so for January, which was taken as a good omen by those inclined toward omens. The crowd was large and enthusiastic. There are accounts of her laughing and waving and engaging with the people who called out to her along the route, of her receiving gifts from ordinary citizens with apparent pleasure, of her overall demeanour being that of someone genuinely delighted to be where she was. This is sometimes read as political performance. It probably was, in part, but the accounts are consistent enough and specific enough to suggest that the delight was also real. She had survived a great deal to reach this street and this crowd, and she knew it. The ceremony itself was conducted by the Bishop of Carlisle, Owen Oglethorpe, because all the senior bishops were Catholics unwilling to perform a Protestant coronation, and the newly appointed Protestant bishops had not yet been formally consecrated. There were accommodations made, compromises observed, the kind of religious fudging that would characterize the early years of her reign as she tried to figure out how to hold England together across a theological divide that her father had created and her siblings had deepened. She was anointed. She was crowned with the same crown that had been placed on the heads of her predecessors, and she became, officially and irrevocably, Elizabeth I, Queen of England, France and Ireland, Defender of the Faith. France was technically there because English monarchs had been claiming the French throne since Edward III, and nobody had quite gotten around to dropping the claim even after losing the actual territory. It was the kind of detail that suggests something important about the nature of royal titles, which is that they describe aspiration as much as reality, and are sometimes easier to keep than to explain the absence of. She was queen. The problem of what to do with that was just beginning. Building a court, building a myth. The first years of Elizabeth's reign were defined by 2 parallel projects that were always happening at the same time, reinforcing each other, each making the other more possible. The first was the practical work of actually governing England, establishing policy, managing Parliament, settling the religious question, handling foreign relations. The second was the construction of the image, the Elizabeth who would become not just a monarch but a myth, a figure so thoroughly associated with her country and her age that 4.5 centuries later we still call the whole era Elizabethan. Both projects required intelligence and patience and a very high tolerance for complexity. Both projects also required the same underlying quality, an understanding of the difference between what you actually are and what you need people to believe you are, and a willingness to manage that gap actively rather than leaving it to chance. Start with the practical. The Privy Council that Elizabeth assembled in the first weeks of her reign was a deliberate construction. She kept some members from Mary's council, because removing everyone would have destabilised the government, and because she was not interested in revenge for its own sake. She added her own people, Protestants, men of business rather than men of faction. She made Cecil the centre of the administrative web. She appointed men who knew their areas, finance, law, foreign affairs, and she expected them to do their jobs. She was not a delegating monarch in the sense of handing things off and forgetting about them. She read, she questioned, she demanded information, and she held people to account for what they had promised. The religious settlement was the first and in some ways the most important legislative achievement of the early reign. The Act of Supremacy in 1559 re-established royal supremacy over the church, making the monarch supreme governor rather than supreme head, a subtle change in title that gave slightly less offence to Catholic sensibilities without changing the substance of the thing. The Act of Uniformity imposed the use of the prayer book for church services, a moderately Protestant document that was Protestant enough for most reformers without being aggressively evangelical. The settlement was a compromise, which meant that committed Catholics found it too Protestant, and committed Protestants found it too Catholic, which was more or less exactly what Elizabeth intended. She wanted a church that most people could live with, not a church that perfectly satisfied any particular theological position. Elizabeth herself seems to have held theological views that were genuinely personal and somewhat difficult to pin down with precision. She was certainly Protestant in her sympathies, trained in the Protestant tradition, surrounded by Protestant advisers. But she retained some Catholic ceremonial preferences, keeping candles on her altar, reportedly disliking clergy marriages, not being particularly interested in sermons of the extended Calvinist variety. She found religious enthusiasm of any kind slightly alarming, and the kind of reformed Protestantism that wanted to tear out all the stained glass and abolish the bishops struck her as both aesthetically and politically dangerous. She wanted, essentially, an English church that was orderly and decent, and that everyone could more or less agree was Christian, without getting too specific about the details. This drove the more committed Protestants in her circle to distraction. They wanted a thorough reformation. She wanted order and stability and the widest possible coalition of people who would accept the same Sunday service without making trouble about it. She mostly got what she wanted, which was impressive. Alongside the practical administration, the image-making was beginning. The image of Elizabeth that would eventually crystallize into the iconic portraits of the mid-reign and late reign, the white-faced, richly dressed, bejeweled figure surrounded by symbolic objects drawn from classical mythology and Protestant iconography, was not created overnight. It was built up over decades through a combination of portraiture, literature, public ceremonial, and the careful management of what Elizabeth herself said and wore and did in public. But the foundations were laid early. Elizabeth understood with a clarity that most of her contemporaries did not quite match, that a monarch is a symbolic as well as a practical figure, and that the symbol needs maintenance the same way that the practical machinery of government does. She was always performing queenship, which is not the same as saying she was always insincere. The performance was real, it was just also managed. She was, for example, exceptionally careful about her public appearances and what they communicated. The royal progresses she began undertaking from the early years of her reign, moving through the country and staying at the great houses of her nobility, were not vacations. They were political theatre of the highest order, allowing her to be seen, to make the relationship between the Queen and her country personal and visible and reciprocal rather than abstract. People came out to watch her pass and she spoke to them, sometimes stopping to receive gifts or to hear petitions, sometimes making informal remarks that were clever and warm and immediately repeated and embellished. The speeches she gave were another instrument of the image. Elizabeth was genuinely gifted as a public speaker, and she seems to have genuinely enjoyed speaking publicly in a way that not every monarch does. There is an energy in her recorded speeches that suggests not just competence but pleasure, the pleasure of someone who is very good at something and knows it and is doing it in front of an audience. Then there were the portraits. The portraits of Elizabeth are a subject in themselves, and we will return to them later in the context of her aging and the management of her image in the later years of her reign. But even the early portraits show a deliberate construction. The Clopton portrait, the Hampton portrait, the various images from the 1560s all show a woman dressed and positioned with a care that goes beyond ordinary vanity. The jewels she wears mean things. The colours mean things. The objects she holds or that appear beside her mean things. The portraits are not pictures of a woman. They are arguments about what a woman can be. She also very deliberately cultivated the idea of herself as exceptional. As a woman ruling in a world organised around male authority, she could not simply claim the same kind of authority that male monarchs claimed. She had to do something else, and what she chose to do was construct a self that was simultaneously and paradoxically female and beyond gender. She would invoke her sex when it was useful, appealing to the loyalty owed to a helpless woman, and she would transcend her sex when that was useful, asserting that she had the heart of a king. She played both cards simultaneously and with great skill. The closest modern analogy I can think of is a brand strategy, which sounds deeply unromantic but is not entirely inaccurate. She was creating and managing an entity called Elizabeth, Queen of England, which was related to but not identical with the actual person Elizabeth Tudor. The entity was eternal, divine, symbolic. The person was mortal and sometimes frightened and sometimes lonely and sometimes wrong. The management of the gap between them was the central artistic and political project of her life. She was 25 when she began this project. She would not entirely stop until she died at 69. The marriage question. If you want to understand what made Elizabeth's Parliament simultaneously devoted to her and driven to the absolute edge of collective madness by her, you need to spend some time with the marriage question. It ran through her entire reign like a recurring argument in a very long relationship, surfacing at every crisis, producing extraordinary scenes of parliamentary petition and queenly deflection, and never reaching the resolution that everyone except Elizabeth appeared to want. The expectation was not unreasonable. She was a young queen without an heir. The succession was uncertain. Her nearest claim was Mary, Queen of Scots, who was Catholic and French allied, and therefore unacceptable to most of the Protestant political class. If Elizabeth died childless, the most likely outcome was civil war, or a Catholic succession, or both, and nobody wanted either. On top of which, the dominant theory of governance held that women were not suited to rule alone. This was not a fringe opinion. It was the mainstream consensus, derived from classical philosophy, from scripture, from centuries of tradition. The expectation that a queen would supply her deficiencies by marrying a husband who would do the actual governing was near universal. Mary had tried it with Philip of Spain, and it had not gone well, but the expectation itself remained entirely intact. So the pressure came from every direction. Parliament petitioned her in 1559, 1563, 1566, 1567, and various moments in between. Her council argued with her privately. Ambassadors brought proposals from foreign courts. Everyone had an opinion, and the opinions did not agree with each other, which at least meant she could not satisfy everyone even in theory. The suitors were numerous. Philip of Spain proposed almost immediately after her accession, which she declined with politeness and no intention of reconsidering. She was not going to repeat her sister's mistake of marrying the Spanish king and becoming a subsidiary element in a vast Habsburg operation. Archduke Charles of Austria became the most serious continental candidate, with negotiations running for years and genuine enthusiasm on the Austrian side, and an elaborate performance of serious consideration on Elizabeth's side that concealed a fundamental unwillingness to commit to anything. The sticking point was religion. Charles would not renounce Catholicism. Elizabeth would not tolerate a consort hearing Mass in the next room. Eric of Sweden sent a delegation to England while simultaneously courting Mary, Queen of Scots as a backup option, which managed to be tactless in every possible direction at once. There was a young French king who was 17 years younger than Elizabeth, a gap that was discussed as though it were negotiable, which it was not really, and underneath all of these negotiations, complicating all of them, was Robert Dudley. He'd been her favourite from the first weeks of the reign, occupying a position in her personal life that was unmistakable and that scandalised the court. When his wife Amy Robsart was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in 1560, the inquest returned a verdict of accidental death, and nobody was entirely convinced. The circumstances were suspicious enough that the suspicion clung to Dudley permanently, and an English queen who married the man suspected of murdering his wife would have destroyed her credibility with her own people and with every foreign court simultaneously. So Dudley remained the favourite who could not be the husband, which did not resolve anything. Elizabeth's responses to parliamentary pressure on the marriage question were among the most brilliant performances of her reign. She acknowledged the concern. She wept occasionally. She implied she was considering the matter seriously. She never committed to anything. In 1566, she told Parliament she was already married, held up the coronation ring, and said she was bound to a husband, which was the Kingdom of England. It is technically non-responsive to the question, and somehow feels like a complete answer. That is the Elizabeth trick, and she performed it with a consistency that bordered on art. Why did she never marry? The honest answer is that no single explanation covers it. Childbirth was dangerous. Foreign husbands brought foreign entanglements. Dudley was politically impossible. English noblemen would have upset the balance of the court. The Seymour years had taught her that marriage meant vulnerability. Her mother's fate had demonstrated what happened to women whose usefulness expired. All of it is true. None of it is the whole story. What she did, with extraordinary skill, was turn the question from a problem into a tool. The perpetual possibility of marriage gave her diplomatic leverage without the cost of actual marriage. She kept the door almost open for 45 years. It never quite swung wide. She was 50 when the last serious negotiation ended. She cried when the French Duke went home, and the door quietly finally closed. The problem of Mary Queen of Scots. There are people whose existence creates problems simply by virtue of what they are, regardless of what they actually do. Mary Queen of Scots was, for Elizabeth, precisely that kind of person. She did not need to plot to be dangerous. Her lineage was enough. She was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister Margaret, which made her, in Catholic eyes, the legitimate claimant to the English throne, since Catholics did not recognise the validity of Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, and therefore did not recognise Elizabeth's legitimacy at all. She was Catholic. She was, by all accounts, strikingly beautiful in person. She was Queen of Scotland and Queen Consort of France. She was, in brief, the most dangerous person in Europe for Elizabeth, and she had not yet done anything wrong. Then she started doing things wrong. Her husband Francis II died in 1560. She returned to Scotland in 1561, arriving in a country that had undergone a Protestant Reformation during her years in France, led by the ferocious and entirely uncompromising John Knox, who did not approve of Mary and was constitutionally incapable of being quiet about it. Mary tried to rule as a Catholic queen over a Protestant country, which was the mirror image of what Elizabeth was doing in England, and produced the opposite results. Where Elizabeth's pragmatism created a workable settlement, Mary's combination of Catholic conviction and personal impulsiveness produced a series of disasters that accelerated with remarkable efficiency. She married her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, in 1565. Darnley was vain, jealous, politically incompetent, and possessed of his own claim to the English throne, which alarmed Elizabeth on purely dynastic grounds. He became convinced that Mary's Italian secretary had too much influence over the Queen, possibly romantic influence, and had him murdered in Mary's presence while she was pregnant. This is the kind of marriage that does not recover. Darnley himself was murdered in February 1567, in circumstances that strongly suggested Mary knew about the plot, and then she married the man widely suspected of organising the murder only 3 months later. Whether or not she was complicit in Darnley's death, marrying the Earl of Bothwell immediately afterward made her look complicit, and destroyed whatever sympathy she had retained. The Scottish lords rose against her. She was forced to abdicate. She escaped captivity in 1568, lost the Battle of Langside, ran out of Scottish options entirely, and made the fateful decision to flee to England and throw herself on her cousin Elizabeth's mercy. Elizabeth's response is one of the most instructive moments of the reign. She did not welcome Mary. She did not return her to Scotland. She did not hand her to the Scottish lords who wanted to put her on trial. She did not send her to France, where she had powerful connections and would have been free. She kept her imprisoned for 19 years. The logic was this: Mary was an anointed queen, and Elizabeth believed in a queen's right to rule with a conviction that was partly principled and partly self-interested, since endorsing the idea that subjects could depose their monarch had obvious implications for her own position. Releasing her to France meant releasing a dynastic weapon into dangerous hands. Executing her without clear evidence of treason would outrage every Catholic court in Europe. Welcoming her freely meant welcoming a rival claim into the English court itself. So Elizabeth chose imprisonment. Comfortable imprisonment, it should be said, with her own household and adequate resources, but imprisonment nonetheless. Mary, being Mary, could not stop plotting. She wrote to the Pope, to Philip of Spain, to the Guise family in France. She became the focal point for every conspiracy against Elizabeth launched in the 1570s and 80s. The Ridolfi plot of 1571 aimed to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne alongside the Duke of Norfolk. When it was discovered, Norfolk was executed. Mary was not, though Parliament demanded her death with impressive consistency. The end came with the Babington plot in 1586. Mary, corresponding through a channel she believed secure but which Francis Walsingham's intelligence operation had thoroughly penetrated, wrote a letter explicitly approving a plan to assassinate Elizabeth. The letter was intercepted. The evidence was overwhelming. She was tried at Fotheringhay Castle, refused to recognise the court's jurisdiction over a queen, was convicted anyway, and sentenced to death. Elizabeth spent 3 months refusing to sign the warrant. She wept. She said she wished the deed done without her having to do it. Eventually the council signed it themselves, and on the 8th of February 1587, Mary was executed at Fotheringhay. She wore dark red underneath her outer gown, the Catholic colour of martyrdom. She prayed in Latin. The axe fell 3 times. When the executioner held up her head, it fell from his hand. She had been wearing a wig. Her own hair was grey. She was 44 years old. Elizabeth's fury afterward lasted for months. Whether it was genuine or performed has been argued ever since. Probably both. With Elizabeth, it was usually both. Religion and the Middle Way. Before we proceed to the Armada and to the great international dramas of the Middle Reign, it is worth pausing to look at the thing that underpinned so much of what happened in Elizabethan England, the religious settlement, what it actually was, how it worked in practice, and why Elizabeth was so fiercely protective of it, even when reformers pushed her to go further. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 established the Church of England on a middle path between the Catholic and Protestant extremes. The prayer book that was required for use in all church services was recognisably Protestant in its theology, rejecting the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation and the authority of the Pope, but it retained a good deal of traditional ceremonial and liturgical form, vestments, set prayers, the rhythms of the church calendar, that gave it a texture more familiar to those coming from a Catholic background than the stripped bare austerity of the Swiss Reformed churches. The settlement was a compromise, as we noted in the context of Elizabeth's court building, but it was a compromise of a particular and sophisticated kind. It was designed not to satisfy everyone, but to be acceptable to most people, and to create a church broad enough that all but the most committed Catholics and the most ardent Protestants could find a way to worship in it without feeling that their essential convictions were being violated. Elizabeth's personal engagement with religion is one of the most interesting questions about her inner life. She was certainly not irreligious. Her speeches and letters are saturated with religious language and imagery that feels genuine rather than merely conventional. She prayed privately. She studied scripture. She had a genuine theological sensibility that was Protestant but not Calvinist, reformed but not puritanical, committed but not fanatical. The thing she appears to have disliked most about the more intense Protestant reformers was not the content of their beliefs exactly, but the manner of their conviction. She found religious enthusiasm slightly vulgar, in the way that she found all extreme emotion slightly vulgar. She wanted a church that was decent and orderly, and that did not make excessive demands on private conscience. She reportedly once told the bishops that they must not talk too much in their sermons, which is probably the most Church of England sentiment ever expressed by anyone. The problem of the recusants, the Catholics who refused to attend Protestant services, was a persistent irritant throughout the reign. The penalties for recusancy, for absence from church, were fines and eventually imprisonment, and they escalated over time, particularly after the Pope issued a bull in 1570 excommunicating Elizabeth and releasing her Catholic subjects from their allegiance to her. This transformed English Catholics from people who had a different religion to people who had a potentially treasonous religion, and the distinction between religious dissent and political disloyalty became progressively harder to maintain. Elizabeth herself did not want to persecute Catholics for their beliefs. She said famously that she did not wish to make windows into men's souls. She was interested in outward conformity, in attendance at church services, not in what people thought during those services or what they did in the privacy of their own homes. But the political situation made private belief increasingly hard to separate from public conduct, especially as Catholic priests trained on the continent began entering England clandestinely to minister to recusant communities and to, in some cases, actively encourage resistance to the Protestant settlement. The Jesuit mission to England, beginning in 1580, brought men like Edmund Campion and Robert Persons into the country with a courage and a commitment to their faith that was genuine and extraordinary, and that put them, under the laws of the time, at risk of execution for treason. Campion was captured, tortured, and executed in 1581. The manner of his death, hanged, drawn, and quartered, the standard punishment for treason but a particularly horrifying one, caused revulsion among English Catholics, and some sympathy even among Protestants. Elizabeth's reign was not, when it came to religious persecution, the clean story of Protestant tolerance that later Protestant memory sometimes wanted it to be. Catholics suffered under her laws, Priests were executed. Recusants were fined into poverty. The cult of Protestant martyrology that made Mary's reign so infamous was applied to the Catholic experience of Elizabeth's reign by contemporary Catholic writers with some justice. At the same time, the persecution under Elizabeth was not comparable in scale to the systematic burning of Mary's reign. And the difference was not just a matter of method, but of intent. Elizabeth was not trying to force her subjects to believe what she believed. She was trying to ensure that her subjects did not act in ways that threatened the political stability of the kingdom. That distinction mattered to her, even when the practical results were grim. The Puritan wing of the Church presented a different kind of challenge. The Puritans were not Catholic threats to Protestant England, but Protestant zealots who thought the settlement had not gone far enough and wanted a more thoroughly reformed church. They wanted bishops abolished or at least stripped of their authority. They wanted the elaborate ceremonial vestments Elizabeth insisted on removed. They wanted longer sermons and shorter liturgy. They wanted, essentially, a different kind of church, and they pushed for it through Parliament and through the church itself with considerable persistence. Elizabeth's response to Puritan pressure was consistent and firm. She would not allow Parliament to legislate on matters of religion, which she considered part of her royal prerogative. She would not abolish the bishops, who were instrumentally useful to her as a governing class, and who she also had a genuine constitutional attachment to. She would not allow the settlement to be disturbed from the left any more than she would allow it to be disturbed from the right. What she achieved was, over the course of the reign, the gradual normalisation of the Church of England as simply what England was and had always been. People who grew up in Elizabeth's England grew up going to the same church, hearing the same prayers, following the same calendar. By the end of the reign, the Elizabethan Church felt less like a compromise and more like a tradition, which was precisely what she had wanted it to become. It was not perfect. It satisfied nobody completely, but it held. And in the religious wars that were tearing Europe apart in this period, that holding was itself a significant achievement. The world beyond England's shores, England in 1558 was not a major maritime power. This needs to be stated clearly because the image of Elizabethan England as a great seafaring nation of adventurers and explorers is so strongly established in popular memory that it's easy to forget how recent and how initially tentative that maritime ambition was. When Elizabeth came to the throne, England had a small navy, limited overseas experience, and a coastline-focused trading culture. The great oceanic empires were Spanish and Portuguese. England was a relatively minor player in the global drama that had been unfolding since Columbus reached the Americas in 1492. What happened during Elizabeth's reign was the beginning of a change in that situation, driven partly by political ambition, partly by commercial appetite, partly by the particular combination of boldness and recklessness that characterized a certain type of Elizabethan adventurer. It was not a planned expansion. It was more like a series of individual improvisations that added up over time to something that looked like a strategy. Francis Drake is the most famous of the Elizabethan sea captains, and he deserves his fame while also being rather more complicated than the legend. He was born in Devon around 1540, the son of a Protestant minister, and went to sea young. He made his name and made himself very wealthy through privateering, which is the polite word for legally sanctioned piracy, attacking Spanish ships and Spanish colonial settlements with the tacit encouragement of the English crown. The Spanish, understandably, did not see a meaningful distinction between piracy and privateering. To them, Drake was a pirate. To Drake, he was an instrument of English Protestant policy against the Catholic Empire of Spain, which conveniently also involved taking their gold. The distinction mattered legally but not practically. He was a brilliant navigator, a ruthless commander, and a man of considerable personal courage and considerable personal vanity, which is not unusual in brilliant navigators. His circumnavigation of the globe, completed between 1577 and 1580, was the second in history, after Magellan's expedition half a century before. Magellan died on his voyage. Drake came back. He came back rich, having raided Spanish settlements along the Pacific coast of South America, crossed the Pacific, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and arrived home to a welcome from Elizabeth that included knighthood, performed on the deck of his ship the Golden Hind. The Spanish ambassador protested. Elizabeth was cheerful about his protests. The privateers were doing valuable work, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. John Hawkins was Drake's cousin, and a different kind of figure, in some ways a more troubling one. Hawkins pioneered English involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, which is to say he pioneered one of the most profitable and most morally catastrophic enterprises in human history. He conducted 3 major slaving voyages in the 1560s, capturing or buying enslaved Africans on the West African coast and transporting them to the Spanish Caribbean, where he sold them at considerable profit, despite Spanish attempts to exclude English traders from their colonial markets. Elizabeth was an investor in Hawkins's voyages. This is one of those historical facts that does not get quite the emphasis it deserves in the romantic nationalist version of the Elizabethan story. The Queen, whose image would later be invoked in British celebrations of national achievement, was an investor in the slave trade. The connection between Elizabethan commercial ambition and the long catastrophe of the Atlantic slave trade is not incidental. It is foundational. Martin Frobisher made 3 voyages to the Arctic in the 1570s, looking for a northwest passage to Asia. He did not find one, but he did find large quantities of a black ore on Baffin Island that he was convinced contained gold. He brought back shiploads of it to England. The ore turned out to be iron pyrite, fool's gold. The whole enterprise collapsed in loss and embarrassment. Frobisher moved on to other things, as Elizabethan adventurers generally did, and eventually died fighting for Elizabeth in France in 1594, which is perhaps not the most distinguished end for someone who had sailed to the Arctic, but it was at least a vigorous one. Walter Raleigh is perhaps the most Elizabethan of the Elizabethan adventurers in the sense of embodying both the glamour and the futility of the Elizabethan colonial project. He was handsome, brilliant, vain, poetic, and comprehensively unable to manage money. He sponsored the attempt to found the first English colony in North America at Roanoke in present-day North Carolina in 1585 and 1587. The first settlement was abandoned. The second, the famous Lost Colony, disappeared entirely, and nobody has ever conclusively determined what happened to the 115 people who were left there. Raleigh never actually went to Roanoke himself, which is either a practical detail or a telling one depending on your reading of his character. He named the territory Virginia in honour of his queen, which is one of the more romantic gestures of the reign, and one that Elizabeth seems to have been genuinely pleased by. Raleigh was one of Elizabeth's more extravagant favourites, and she was fond of him in the way that she was sometimes fond of brilliant and showy men who flattered her lavishly, which he did. His later fall from favour, when he secretly married one of her maids of honour, was correspondingly dramatic. What do we make of this age of exploration from the perspective of its results rather than its romance? England was laying the foundations of what would eventually become a colonial empire, though that empire would be built mostly after Elizabeth's death, and in ways she did not directly plan. The voyages of her reign were more exploratory than colonizing, more about establishing the capacity and the appetite for overseas enterprise than about actually establishing permanent overseas settlements. They were also not without their darker dimensions: the slave trade, the violence of privateering, the appalling conditions experienced by the ordinary sailors who crewed these voyages, who were badly paid, badly fed, subject to disease and shipwreck, and whose names do not appear in the accounts that celebrate Drake and Hawkins and Frobisher. The Elizabethan age of exploration was genuinely exciting and genuinely adventurous, and also genuinely brutal, and holding all of those things together is what honest history requires. Elizabeth's role in all of this was characteristically oblique. She encouraged the adventurers, invested in their voyages, shielded them from Spanish diplomatic protests, gave them licenses and occasionally knighthoods. But she was careful to maintain plausible deniability when it suited her, insisting when Philip of Spain complained about Drake that she had not authorized his attacks on Spanish shipping, while privately being perfectly aware that she had done exactly that. She was, in other words, doing the same thing she always did, encouraging the outcome she wanted while maintaining the flexibility to disavow it if the outcome proved inconvenient. It was a characteristic approach. It often worked, and it was, when it did not work, the kind of thing that provoked exactly the response the next chapter describes. Ireland, the wound that wouldn't close. There is a version of Elizabeth's reign that deals entirely with its glories and its successes and the golden image and the poetry and the exploration. This chapter is a corrective to that version, because if you want to understand Elizabeth's reign honestly, you have to look at Ireland, and Ireland does not fit comfortably into the golden story. England had claimed lordship over Ireland since the 12th century, and had maintained a presence there through the Pale, the area around Dublin that was under consistent English control, and through a network of often contentious relationships with the Gaelic Irish lords who controlled the rest of the island. The relationship between England and Ireland was already ancient and already unhappy by the time Elizabeth came to the throne, and her reign made it worse. The reasons for this are complex, and the responsibility is not entirely on one side. The Irish political situation in the 16th century was fragmented, with Gaelic chieftains whose authority was organised on very different principles from English feudalism, and who had legitimate grievances about the expansion of English power into areas where it had not previously reached. The English administration in Dublin was chronically underfunded, badly managed, and often staffed by men who were simultaneously incompetent and predatory. The attempt to extend English common law and English governance across Ireland was resisted because it was alien, because it was poorly executed, and because it came accompanied by land confiscation and plantation, the replacement of Gaelic landholders with English and Scottish Protestant settlers. Ireland was also, from Elizabeth's perspective, primarily a strategic concern. The island lay on England's western flank and could be used by Spain or France as a base for operations against England. The fact that the majority of the Irish population was Catholic gave her Catholic enemies a potential point of leverage. The anxiety about Ireland as a backdoor for invasion was real and not entirely unreasonable. The response to this anxiety was a series of military campaigns of increasing brutality. The Munster campaign of the 1560s and 1570s, the Desmond rebellions, the suppression of which involved deliberate destruction of food supplies and the reduction of large parts of Munster to starvation. Edmund Spenser, who wrote The Faerie Queene, and who was by any literary standard one of the greatest poets of the age, witnessed the famine in Munster and described it in terms that have struck later readers as appalling and that were probably accurate. People died in their thousands. Villages were emptied. The countryside was deliberately turned to waste as a military strategy. Spenser also wrote a prose tract called A View of the Present State of Ireland, in which he argued, with the calm reasonableness of a man who had thought carefully about a terrible thing, that Ireland could only be brought to order through the utter extermination of Irish culture and through a thorough military subjugation that did not leave any quarter for resistance. The tract was not published during his lifetime, probably because even Elizabethan England found some of its arguments too extreme for easy public presentation. But it reflects a strain of thinking about Ireland that was real and influential in Elizabethan policy circles. The worst episode of Elizabeth's Irish policy was the 9 Years' War, which ran from 1593 to 1603 and was the most significant military conflict of her reign. It was led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, one of the most gifted commanders and most complex political figures of the age. O'Neill had been educated in England, had been a loyal servant of the English crown for years, and was sophisticated enough to understand both the English political system and the Gaelic political tradition from the inside. When he raised rebellion, he did so with a strategic intelligence and a breadth of coalition building that was unprecedented in Irish resistance to English rule. His great victory at the Yellow Ford in 1598, in which he destroyed an English army, was the worst military defeat England suffered in Ireland in the Tudor period and sent shockwaves through Elizabeth's court. The response was to send the largest army England had yet dispatched to Ireland, under the command of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, about whom more in the next chapter. Essex was a disaster. He squandered his forces, made an unauthorised truce with Tyrone, and then abandoned his command and returned to England without permission, which triggered the crisis that led to his eventual ruin. His replacement was Charles Blount, Lord Mountjoy, who was a more competent commander, and Mountjoy conducted the suppression of the 9 Years' War with a comprehensive brutality that produced results of a kind. The scorched earth policy he employed across Ulster destroyed the food supplies that Tyrone's army depended on. Civilians died in enormous numbers. Contemporary accounts describe people dying of starvation in the fields, the roads lined with the dead, the countryside emptied. These are not peripheral details. They are central to what the suppression of the 9 Years' War actually was. A Spanish force landed in Ireland in 1601 at Kinsale, which was the foreign intervention Elizabeth had always feared and which had come too late to save the rebellion. The combined Irish and Spanish force was defeated at the Battle of Kinsale in January 1602. Tyrone held out for another year before submitting in March 1603. The submission came just days after Elizabeth's death. She died, as we will see, before she knew it was over. What Ireland tells us about Elizabeth and about her reign is uncomfortable. The violence inflicted on the Irish population during these campaigns, the deliberate use of famine as a military weapon, the destruction of a culture and a way of life that was then presented in English propaganda as barbarian and therefore unworthy of preservation, these are real and serious moral failures of the Elizabethan state. They are not entirely Elizabeth's personal moral failures, in the sense that she was making individual decisions about specific atrocities. They are systemic failures, products of a policy and an approach to Ireland that Elizabeth endorsed and directed at the highest level. The England that Elizabeth built and the empire that grew from the England she built carried Ireland's wound with it. It has not entirely healed. The wound would not close in her lifetime. It did not close afterward. The Spanish Armada. In the summer of 1588, the most famous confrontation of Elizabeth's reign began, and it began with a fleet. Not an English fleet, a Spanish one. The reasons why Philip II of Spain decided to attempt the conquest of England in 1588 were both strategic and personal, and the personal dimensions are worth acknowledging because they are sometimes underplayed in accounts that make the Armada sound like an inevitable consequence of geopolitical forces, rather than something a specific man decided to do. Philip had been, remember, married to Elizabeth's sister. He had at one point proposed marriage to Elizabeth herself. He had, for many years, maintained a position of cautious restraint toward England despite the provocations of Drake's raids on his shipping and his colonial settlements, because a Protestant England was more strategically useful to him as a barrier against France than a disrupted England under a new regime might be. What changed that calculus? Several things combined. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots in February 1587 removed the obvious Catholic successor who could have given him a legitimate English regime to install. Drake's raid on Cadiz in 1587, in which he sailed into the harbour and destroyed a substantial part of the fleet being assembled for the Armada, temporarily delayed but did not deter the enterprise. The continuing English support for the Protestant Dutch rebels in the Spanish Netherlands drained Philip's resources and extended his wars. And there was a sense, by 1587, that the time for waiting was over. The Armada that sailed from Lisbon in May 1588 was enormous by the standards of the age. 130 ships, around 22,000 men, an unprecedented concentration of naval force. The plan was for this fleet to sail up the English Channel, link up with the Spanish army of Flanders commanded by the Duke of Parma, which would then cross in barges and land on the English coast. The invasion force, combined Spanish naval escort and Flemish army, would then march on London. It was a plan of considerable logical coherence that required everything to work precisely, at sea, in the English Channel, across the shallow waters of the Flemish coast, in coordination between two forces that could not communicate with each other in any reliable way. It was the kind of plan that looks excellent on paper, and then encounters contact with actual reality. The English response was commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham, the Lord Admiral, with Drake as his Vice Admiral. The English fleet was smaller than the Spanish and composed of different types of ships, faster and more manoeuvrable than the heavier Spanish galleons, armed with longer-range guns that could engage at a distance rather than requiring the close-quarters grappling that Spanish tactics traditionally relied on. The technological difference was real, but not decisive on its own. What was decisive was a combination of English tactical skill, Spanish logistical problems, and weather. The Armada entered the English Channel at the end of July. The fighting that followed over the next week was not a single dramatic battle but a running engagement. The English fleet harrying the Spanish at long range, the Spanish unable to force the close engagement they needed, neither side able to land the knockout blow they wanted. The Spanish moved up the Channel in their famous crescent formation, maintaining discipline under fire with a professionalism that was genuinely impressive. They anchored off Calais on the 27th of July, waiting for Parma's forces to come out from Dunkirk. Parma could not come out. The Dutch flyboats, shallow draft warships that could operate in the shallow coastal waters the Spanish galleons could not enter, were blockading the Flemish ports. Parma's invasion barges could not reach the Armada. The link-up that the whole plan depended on was impossible. On the night of the 28th of July, the English sent fireships, unmanned burning vessels, into the anchored Spanish fleet. The psychological effect was more significant than the physical damage. The Spanish cut their anchor cables and scattered in panic, breaking their formation. In the subsequent engagement off Gravelines on the 29th of July, the English inflicted real damage, sinking several ships and killing significant numbers of men, but it was the weather that completed the Armada's destruction. The Spanish commander Medina Sidonia decided rightly that he could not fight his way back down the Channel through the English fleet, and chose instead to sail north around Scotland and Ireland to return to Spain. The storms that caught the Armada as it rounded Scotland and Ireland were ferocious, and the Spanish ships, many damaged and with crews suffering from disease and hunger, were smashed on rocks and beaches along the west coast of Ireland. Somewhere between 40 and 60 ships were lost. Perhaps 20,000 men died on the whole campaign, either in the fighting or in the wreck on the Irish coast. It was a catastrophe for Spain and a triumph for England, but we should be careful about the nature of the triumph. England did not defeat the Armada primarily through naval skill or tactical brilliance, though both played a role. The fundamental reasons for the Armada's failure were Philip's plan, which required a level of coordination that the communications technology of the time could not deliver, and the weather. The Spanish were beaten by storms as much as by Drake. Elizabeth's great moment in the Armada summer, the thing that has echoed down through history more than any tactical detail of the naval engagement, was not at sea at all. It was at Tilbury, on the north bank of the Thames, where English land forces had assembled to resist the expected invasion. She rode out to review them on the 9th of August, by which point the Armada was already scattered, and the threat substantially diminished, though this was not fully known at Tilbury. What she said has become one of the most famous speeches in English history. She acknowledged that she had the body of a weak and feeble woman. Then she said that she had the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and she thought foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of her realm. She told them that for their loyalty she would see them rewarded. She told them that she herself would take up arms and be their general and their rewarder. The speech was delivered on horseback, in armour, to soldiers who had been waiting in the mud and the summer heat for an invasion that had not come. The theatricality of it was complete and deliberate. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was giving them the image they needed and giving them herself as the image. The queen who was also a warrior, the woman who had the heart of a king. It worked. It worked in the moment, and it worked for centuries afterward. The Tilbury speech is how Elizabeth wanted to be remembered, and it is how she was remembered. The image of her on that horse, in that armour, making that claim about her heart, is one of the indelible images of English history. The aftermath of the Armada is worth noting. The celebrations were real, and they were justified, because England had survived an attempted invasion that might genuinely have destroyed everything Elizabeth had built. But the war with Spain did not end. It continued until after Elizabeth's death. The English counter-armada of 1589, led by Drake and Norris, was a humiliating failure that cost thousands of lives. The war dragged on through the 1590s with victories and defeats on both sides, draining English resources and producing nothing decisive. The Armada was not the end of anything except, perhaps, the phase of the reign when the great symbolic moments came easily. The favourite. Robert Dudley and the question of love. There is a question at the centre of Elizabeth's personal life that has been asked continuously for 4 centuries, and that cannot be answered with certainty. Did she love Robert Dudley? Was the love reciprocated? What exactly was the nature of what existed between them, this relationship that lasted from the beginning of her reign to his death in 1588? This attachment that survived Amy Robsart's death and 1,000 political complications and the impossibility of marriage and decades of other relationships and other suitors. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive, which is exactly how Elizabeth would have wanted it. She was not a woman who allowed the complete picture of her interior life to be visible to others, and on the subject of Dudley particularly, she was careful. But the evidence we have is enough to work with. Robert Dudley was the 5th son of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the man who had tried to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne and had been executed for it. Robert had been condemned to death himself, along with his brothers, and had been in the Tower when Elizabeth herself was briefly imprisoned there in 1554. Whether they had any direct contact during this period is unclear, but the coincidence is striking. 2 people who would later be at the centre of English history, both prisoners in the same fortress at the same moment. He had been released and pardoned after the execution of his father. He had served in the wars in Europe. He had married Amy Robsart in 1550 when they were both teenagers, a love match by all accounts, at least at the beginning. When Elizabeth came to the throne, he was immediately part of her court and immediately distinguished from the other men at court by the particular quality of her attention to him. He was good-looking, very good-looking by the accounts of those who saw him in person. Tall and dark where the typical Elizabethan ideal was fair, with a physical confidence and a kind of animal vitality that clearly worked on Elizabeth. He could ride and dance and joust and handle himself in the ceremonial physical culture of the Tudor court, with an ease that she found attractive in a simple and uncomplicated way. She enjoyed looking at him. This is clear from the accounts. But it was not only physical. They had grown up in the same world, had moved in the same orbit since childhood, shared the same cultural references and the same understanding of what the Tudor court was and how it worked. He made her laugh. The relationship had an ease to it, a familiarity, that her other relationships often did not. He called her his eyes, which she reciprocated in her correspondence as she called him her eyes in return. She made him master of the horse, one of the most intimate positions at court, and then gave him every honour that could be heaped on him without making him her consort. And she gave those honours with an open-handedness that even her council found remarkable. Amy Robsart's death in September 1560 changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Dudley was almost certainly innocent of his wife's death. The most likely explanation is that Amy was suffering from breast cancer and either fell accidentally down the staircase or fell in some kind of seizure, or in an act of desperation given her illness and her situation, threw herself down deliberately. The investigation that followed reached no conclusion of foul play. But the investigation could not reach a conclusion of no foul play either, because the timing was so appallingly convenient for Dudley that no one could quite believe in the coincidence. Elizabeth knew she could not marry him. Her counsel told her so in terms that were diplomatic but firm. Cecil, who did not much like Dudley and accurately perceived him as a competing source of influence over the Queen, was particularly clear about this. Foreign ambassadors reported with varying degrees of glee that the Queen was in love with her horsemaster, and that the horsemaster had possibly killed his wife. The story was everywhere in Europe before the body was barely cold. Elizabeth knew. She understood perfectly what Amy Robsart's death had done to the possibility of marrying Dudley. She also understood, one suspects, what it would have meant even without Amy's death, what it would have cost her in terms of political capital and foreign policy flexibility. She kept him. She kept him closer than was wise and farther than she wanted, in the specific position of beloved favourite who would never be elevated to husband. The relationship was the most important personal relationship of her life, or at least competed for that position with Cat Ashley, who died in 1565 and whose death affected Elizabeth visibly. Dudley was the person she turned to in private. He was the person she was most genuinely herself with. The correspondence between them, what survives, has a different quality from her other letters, less formal, more urgent, occasionally more desperate. When she was ill, she relied on him. When he was ill, she was frightened in a way that she did not perform for anyone else's benefit. She made him Earl of Leicester in 1564, creating him the nobleman that she could not quite bring herself to make her husband. The ceremony of creation was notable for a detail that speaks volumes. She could not stop herself touching him during the ceremony, tickling the back of his neck, her hand resting on him with a naturalness that was entirely public and entirely unguarded. For a woman who was almost always guarded, the detail is significant. In 1578, Dudley secretly married Lettice Knollys, who was Elizabeth's cousin and a great beauty, and who had been at court. When Elizabeth found out in 1579, her fury was spectacular. She raged. She considered banishing him from court. She turned on Lettice with a venom that went beyond wounded pride into something more genuine and more painful. He was eventually forgiven, because he always was, but the forgiveness took time and the wound did not quite heal. He died in September 1588, just weeks after the Armada's failure. He was sick, possibly of the same malarial fever that had been circulating, and the combination of the campaign strains and his underlying ill health simply stopped him. He was 54. He had written Elizabeth a letter which she received after his death, asking after her health and saying he hoped to hear how his gracious lady did, and other small things. She kept that letter for the rest of her life. When she died, it was found in a casket beside her bed, with the words his last letter written on it in her own hand. She kept it for 15 years. She kept it until the hand that had written the other words stopped moving. I find that almost unbearably touching, and I suspect I am not alone. The later favourites, Essex and The Last Heartbreak. After Dudley, there were others. Elizabeth was not a woman who withdrew from human warmth simply because she had been hurt by it, though the hurt of Dudley's marriage and then Dudley's death was real. She continued to surround herself with charming and attractive men who occupied the position of favourite, which was part ceremonial role, part emotional relationship, and part political phenomenon. The most significant of these later favourites was Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, and his story is the story of the last and most painful miscalculation of Elizabeth's reign. Essex was 20 years younger than Elizabeth. He arrived at court in the 1580s, introduced by his stepfather, who was Dudley himself, which gives the whole situation an elegiac quality if you look at it from the right angle. He was beautiful in a way that Dudley had been beautiful, physically confident and dramatically attractive, with a kind of careless glamour that courts have always found irresistible. Elizabeth found it irresistible. She was in her mid-50s when he arrived in her orbit. He was a young man with red gold hair and enormous energy and enormous ambition, and a complete incapacity to understand the limits that ambition needed to observe. The relationship between Elizabeth and Essex was never simple. It had a genuine affection at its core, on her side certainly and perhaps on his as well, though Essex's affection was always complicated by his need for advancement and his resentment of constraints. He was brave and imaginatively bold and capable of genuine brilliance, but he was also vain, impulsive, and constitutionally unable to take a steady subordinate role, which is a serious disadvantage when your entire career depends on maintaining the favour of a monarch who will not tolerate a challenge to her authority. He served in military campaigns in France and in the raid on Cadiz in 1596, where he distinguished himself and came home to a hero's welcome that went to his head in ways that were not good for anyone. He quarrelled with the Queen openly, in a way that no one who understood Elizabeth would have done. On one famous occasion he turned his back on her in a council meeting, which was an act of contemptuous discourtesy that reduced the other councillors to horrified silence, and Elizabeth struck him across the ear and told him to go and be hanged. He put his hand on his sword. He was restrained. He was eventually forgiven, because Elizabeth kept forgiving Essex in ways that puzzled and frustrated her council. He was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in 1599 and sent to deal with Tyrone, with the largest English army that had yet been dispatched to Ireland. The campaign was a catastrophe, though a slow one. He dissipated his forces in minor operations in the south, rather than striking directly at Tyrone in Ulster, as his instructions required. He lost men to disease and desertion. He held his great confrontation with Tyrone not as a battle, but as a private conversation at a river ford, at the end of which he agreed to a truce without authorization. Then he did the one thing that was most guaranteed to destroy him. He abandoned his command in Ireland and rode back to England without permission, arriving at court unannounced on the morning of the 28th of September, 1599, and bursting into the Queen's bedchamber before she had dressed or her hair arranged. The accounts describe Elizabeth receiving him with outward calm while being, one imagines, incandescent internally. He was arrested, put under house arrest, tried before a council, deprived of his offices. He was not, at this stage, executed. Elizabeth was still, even now, not quite ready to let go of him. What followed was the Essex Rebellion of February 1601. Essex, stripped of his offices, his finances destroyed by the loss of his customs farm income, convinced himself that Elizabeth was surrounded by enemies who had poisoned her against him, Cecil above all, and that the only remedy was to ride through London with his followers, raise the city and present himself to Elizabeth to plead his case directly. It was an insane plan, born of desperation, and an almost delusional inability to assess his own situation accurately. London did not rise. The city watched and did nothing. Essex retreated to his house. He was besieged. He surrendered. He was tried for treason. He was convicted. And Elizabeth finally signed his death warrant. He was executed on the 18th of February 1601 on the Tower Green. He was 35 years old. The execution of Essex affected Elizabeth visibly and lastingly. She had signed the warrant. She had made the decision. She did not publicly repent of it. But the accounts of the last years of her reign describe a woman who was quieter, more melancholy, less given to the energy and the laughter that had characterized her in earlier decades. She's reported to have said in the months after Essex's death that if she had let him live, he would have been her death, or she would have been his, which is probably true, but knowing that a thing was necessary does not make it painless. There was something in Essex that seems to have touched something genuine in Elizabeth, some quality of reckless devotion or physical energy or simple brightness that she responded to in a way that went beyond mere political patronage. He was the last person who had that effect on her. After his death, there were no more favourites in that sense. She was 68 years old, and she had signed the death warrant of someone she had loved, as she had once signed the death warrant of someone she had never quite stopped fearing. The calculus was different. The loneliness was the same. The Essex Rebellion also had political consequences. It made Robert Cecil, the son of the great William Cecil, who had died in 1598, the dominant figure in the Elizabethan council. Robert Cecil was brilliant, physically slight and deeply pragmatic. He had long ago identified James VI of Scotland as the most viable successor to Elizabeth, and he began, carefully and secretly, the correspondence that would ensure the succession went smoothly. Elizabeth either did not know about this or chose not to acknowledge that she knew, which amounts to the same thing practically speaking. The last years were quiet, quieter than they had been. The Queen, who had filled palaces with music and argument and the electric tension of her presence, was becoming someone different, someone who sat more and danced less and sometimes stood staring at nothing in particular for long minutes. She was getting old, in a court that had been organised around her youth, and the adjustment was not easy for anyone, least of all for her. The poets, playwrights, and the Elizabethan Golden Age. Somewhere in the middle of the things we have been talking about, the plots and the armadas and the marriages that never happened, and the executions that did, something else was happening in England. Something that had no immediately obvious connection to foreign policy or religious settlement or the succession question, and that would outlast all of those things by centuries. The English language was flowering. The Elizabethan era produced, in roughly the span of a single human lifetime, a body of literature and drama that has not been matched in quality or density in the English language before or since. Shakespeare is the most famous product of this moment, but Shakespeare alone, extraordinary as he is, does not exhaust it. Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, Philip Sidney, Thomas Kyd, Ben Jonson, John Donne, Francis Bacon, these names are not a supporting cast. Each of them, taken individually, would represent a significant literary moment. The fact that they all lived and worked in roughly the same period and place is one of those concentrations of human talent that history produces occasionally without quite being able to explain. What caused it? Historians of literature argue about this. The printing press was part of it, having been established in England since Caxton in the 1470s, and now producing a reading culture that was wider and more voracious than anything that had existed before. The humanist educational tradition was part of it, having produced a generation of writers who had read the classical authors with genuine attention and absorbed their techniques and their ambitions. The expansion of London itself was part of it, creating a metropolitan audience large and diverse enough to support a commercial theatre industry. But there was also something specific about the Elizabethan moment that seems to have been generative. England was aware of itself as a nation in a new and urgent way. The break with Rome, the Protestant settlement, the threat from Spain, the voyages beyond the known world, these things had given England a sense of itself as a particular place, with a particular identity and a particular destiny, and that sense generated an energy in the culture that came out in the writing. The theatre was the popular art form of the age in a way that has no precise modern equivalent. The playhouses that sprang up on the south bank of the Thames in the 1570s and 80s, the Rose, the Globe, the Swan, drew audiences of 2,000 to 3,000 people at a time, a cross-section of London society from groundlings in the yard to wealthy patrons in the galleries. The plays performed there were not a marginal cultural product for a specialised audience. They were the central entertainment of the city, discussed and quoted and anticipated and argued over, in the way that the most popular television or film might be today. Christopher Marlowe, who was killed in a tavern brawl in 1593 at the age of 29, and who may or may not have been working for Walsingham's intelligence network, wrote plays that transformed what drama in English could be. Dr. Faustus, Tamburlaine, the Jew of Malta. He took the iambic pentameter, the 10-syllable line that had been used in English poetry for centuries, and made it do things in drama that it had never done before, gave it a muscularity and a variety that could carry the full weight of tragedy. Shakespeare learned from Marlowe. Everyone who came after learned from both. Shakespeare himself arrived in London from Stratford-upon-Avon sometime in the late 1580s, a young man of modest background and provincial education who seems to have made himself with extraordinary speed indispensable to the theatrical life of the city. He acted, he wrote, he became a shareholder in the Globe Theatre. He produced over the course of roughly 25 years 37 plays in every dramatic genre, the narrative poems, and 154 sonnets, and the sheer range and depth and humanity of that output remains, 4 centuries later, inexplicable in any simple biographical or historical terms. Elizabeth attended the theatre, or at least had plays performed at court, and Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, later the King's Men, performed at court on numerous occasions, Whether Elizabeth and Shakespeare ever had a direct conversation is not known. The romantic notion that they engaged each other intellectually and that she patronised him personally is not substantiated by evidence. What is true is that the theatrical culture Elizabeth's London supported was the environment in which Shakespeare worked, and that his works, from the histories that celebrated the Tudor dynasty to the comedies that reflected the social world of Elizabethan England, were products of a specific cultural moment she helped create. Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene is the great literary monument to Elizabeth's self-construction as myth. Published in 2 instalments in 1590 and 1596, it is an enormous allegorical poem, unfinished, that was intended to celebrate the moral virtues of the English Protestant nation, and that figures Elizabeth in multiple allegorical forms, most famously as Gloriana, the Faerie Queene herself, but also as Belphoebe, the virginal huntress. Spenser sent the first part to Elizabeth with a dedicatory letter explaining his allegorical scheme. Elizabeth reportedly found it flattering, which she should have, since it was intended to be flattering. Philip Sidney wrote the Arcadia and Astrophil and Stella, and a defence of poetry that shaped English literary theory for generations. He died young, in 1586, of a wound sustained in the Netherlands campaign, in circumstances that produced the most famous act of magnanimity in Elizabethan history, the story of him refusing water on the battlefield and giving it to a wounded soldier with the remark that thy necessity is yet greater than mine. He was 31. Elizabeth mourned him. The court mourned him. He had been, briefly, one of the most promising combinations of soldier and poet and courtier in the European world, and his death was the kind of waste that makes you understand why people invoke the idea of golden ages, because golden ages are partly about what was actually achieved and partly about what was lost before it could be. Elizabeth's relationship to the literary culture of her reign is complex and interesting, and occasionally slightly uncomfortable. She was a genuine patron, in the sense of creating the court atmosphere that made literary and artistic production possible and valued. She was personally literate in a degree that most of her contemporaries could not approach. She appreciated poetry and music with discrimination rather than mere condescension. But she was not a systematic patron of literary talent in the way that some of her contemporaries in other courts were, and the relationship between the writers of her age and the Queen was more indirect than the later myth of Gloriana implies. The Elizabethan Golden Age was as much a product of London's commercial theatre and its popular audiences as it was of court patronage. Shakespeare wrote for crowds, not for queens. The tension between popular culture and court culture, between the commercial and the patronised, between the broad and the refined, is part of what made the period so generative. Art that has to please a wide audience and art that has to please a powerful patron are both under productive constraints, but they are different constraints, and when they exist simultaneously in the same culture, the interaction between them can produce something extraordinary. The Elizabethan literary flowering was extraordinary. It would take another century of English literary effort to produce anything comparable, and in some respects the Jacobean and later literature that followed it was building on foundations laid in this period in ways that the builders themselves were sometimes reluctant to acknowledge. The plays and poems of this age are the most lasting thing Elizabeth's England produced. More lasting than the Armada victory, more lasting than the religious settlement, more lasting than any of the political decisions she agonised over across 4 decades. The language she spoke, the culture she inhabited, was made permanent in them in a way that the political structures of her reign were not. The political structures changed. The language endured. The Virgin Queen, image, reality, and the body of a queen. By the 1580s and 1590s, the image of Elizabeth had become something more elaborate and more strange than the image of any European monarch since the Middle Ages. She was portrayed in the portraits of this period not as an aging woman, which she was, but as something closer to an eternal figure, a symbol rather than a body, dressed in clothing of impossible richness, surrounded by emblematic objects drawn from mythology and scripture and allegory, her face white and smooth and ageless, in ways that no face over 50 is white and smooth and ageless. The portraits of the later reign are collectively known as the Mask of Youth, a term that describes exactly what they are. They are images of a constructed self, a queen as icon rather than queen as person. The Ditchley portrait, painted around 1592 when Elizabeth was 59, shows her standing on a map of England, monumental, dressed in white, her face serene and youthful, a symbol of the nation itself rather than a woman who was approaching 60 with the accumulation of grief and loss and political strain that 60 years in the Tudor world entailed. The construction of this image was deliberate and politically motivated. Elizabeth in the 1580s was ageing. This was not the problem it might be for a private person, but for a monarch whose authority and whose appeal both depended partly on the projection of vitality and quasi-divine grace. It was a political challenge of real significance. The solution her court developed, partly by implicit agreement and partly because she herself controlled what was permitted in her portraiture, was to stop allowing images that showed the real face and to substitute instead the idealized mask. There are accounts from the later years of the reign of courtiers struggling with the gap between the image and the reality. A French ambassador who saw her in the mid-1590s described a woman whose hair was reddish, but clearly a wig, whose face was wrinkled, whose teeth were black, who had one tooth fewer than when he had last seen her. He was being cruel, as ambassadors sometimes were in their private communications, but he was also being accurate. Elizabeth was old. She had not looked like the Ditchley portrait for decades, if she had ever quite looked like it. The cult of the Virgin Queen was the ideological supplement to the visual image. The idea that Elizabeth's virginity was not a lack but a source of power, that her refusal to marry was not a failure but a sacred choice, had been developing since the early years of the reign and reached its fullest elaboration in the later decades. She was identified with the Virgin Mary by Protestant propagandists who understood the emotional vacancy left by the Catholic cult of Mary and deliberately filled it with the image of Elizabeth as England's own Holy Virgin. She was compared to the chaste goddess Diana, to the moon goddess Cynthia, to various classical goddesses of purity and strength. The elaboration of this mythology was undertaken not just by the court, but by the poets and the playwrights and the writers of ceremonial entertainments, with Elizabeth as the always willing central object. The royal progresses that she continued to undertake through the later decades of her reign, when the physical discomfort of travel was becoming genuinely significant, were opportunities for this mythology to be expressed in theatrical form. When she visited the great houses of her nobility, she was greeted with elaborate shows, pageants and allegorical entertainments in which she was cast as Gloriana or Diana or Cynthia, and the local landscape and people were incorporated into an imaginary world in which she was the eternal divine centre. These entertainments could last for days. The famous Kenilworth entertainment of 1575, organised by Dudley at his castle, lasted for 19 days and cost something in the region of £1,000 a day, which was an almost incomprehensible sum. But what was actually going on in the woman behind the image? This is the question that the portraits are deliberately designed to prevent you from asking, and it is therefore the question most worth asking. She was, in the later decades, sometimes lonely. The friends of her early court were dying. Cat Ashley had died in 1565. Cecil, the great William Cecil, who had served her since the first day, died in 1598. Dudley was gone in 1588. Walsingham, her great spymaster, died in 1590. The generation that had built the Elizabethan state with her was disappearing, and the people who remained were their children, who had grown up in the court she had created and who looked at her with a different kind of respect. The respect for an institution rather than for a person. She was also in physical decline, which she managed with a combination of dignity and ferocious denial. She continued to dance into her 60s, which impressed visitors who watched her move across the floor with an energy that belied her age. She continued to ride. She refused to acknowledge weakness. When she was ill, she sometimes refused to go to bed, sitting in a chair through long hours because she could not or would not allow herself to be seen lying down. The lying down suggested mortality, and mortality was not part of the image she was projecting. She was vain. This is worth saying plainly. She had been vain all her life about her appearance, which was something she could not quite help, and which was also entirely rational in a monarch whose appearance was a political tool. In the later years, the vanity took on a slightly desperate quality, because the thing it was trying to hold together, the image of eternal vitality and quasi-divine youth, was increasingly difficult to maintain against the evidence of the mirror. She wore wigs, many of them, in various shades of red. She wore elaborate cosmetics, the white face paint that contained lead, and that, ironically, was probably contributing to the skin damage it was meant to conceal. She wore clothing of extraordinary elaboration, the dresses covered in pearls and jewels and embroidery so dense that the fabric beneath was barely visible. Each element of the dress was symbolic: pearls for purity, certain colours for certain qualities, Emblematic designs worked into the fabric. She dressed herself as a statement every day of her life. Underneath the wig and the white paint and the jewelled dress was a woman who had outlived most of the people she had loved, who was the last of her dynasty, who had spent 45 years making the decisions that kept a kingdom running, and had made some of them wrong, and had sometimes been right in ways that had cost her privately even when they were correct publicly. She was, by any honest assessment, one of the most remarkable people who had ever occupied an English throne. She was also a person with all the complexity and vulnerability that the word implies. The image was real, the person was also real. Both things were true at once. The Long Twilight. The final decade of Elizabeth's reign, from around 1593 to 1603, has a character distinct from the decades before it. The high drama of the Armada and the Mary Queen of Scots crisis was over. Essex was gone by 1601. William Cecil was dead. Walsingham was dead. Dudley was dead. The Elizabethan world was emptying itself of the people who had given it its particular flavour, and the Queen who had presided over it all was old in ways that she was not going to be able to deny indefinitely. England itself was strained. The war with Spain, which had not ended with the Armada, dragged on through the 90s with campaigns in France and the Netherlands, and the continuing catastrophe in Ireland. These wars cost money, and the money came from taxation, and the taxation produced friction with Parliament that was different from the friction of earlier decades. The harvest failures of the mid-1590s, 4 bad harvests in succession, produced real poverty and real hunger in parts of England that had not expected to be poor. The enclosures that were redistributing agricultural land from common use to private use were displacing rural workers in ways that created social dislocation without immediate political solution. The Parliament of 1598 produced Elizabeth's speech on monopolies, which is one of her most genuinely touching performances. Monopolies were licenses granted to individuals giving them exclusive rights over particular trades, and they had proliferated to the point where they were causing real hardship to ordinary people and businesses. Parliament expressed its anger forcefully. Elizabeth's response was not to defend the monopolies, but to promise reform, to acknowledge the validity of the complaints, and to do so in language that managed to be both royal and personal, expressing genuine feeling about her relationship with her people. She said that though God had made her a queen, she counted herself more blessed because she loved her subjects and was beloved by them. She dissolved the most obnoxious monopolies by royal proclamation rather than waiting for parliamentary legislation. It was an elegant solution, and it demonstrates that the political intelligence was still fully operational. But the tone of the speech is different from the tone of the earlier speeches. There is something in it of a person making an accounting, looking back rather than forward, finding the most important thing to be not the power she wielded, but the relationship she had sustained with the people she governed. She was genuinely loved by significant portions of her population, and this is worth emphasizing because it is sometimes obscured by the emphasis on the constructed image. The love was real, on both sides. Elizabeth genuinely cared about what her people thought of her, and genuinely wanted their affection rather than merely their obedience. And the people of England, by and large, provided the affection with a consistency across the decades that was not merely the result of propaganda. She'd governed them for a very long time without ruinous wars or religious persecution on the scale of Mary's reign, or the political chaos that had characterized earlier Tudor governance, and they had a sense of continuity and of national identity that they associated specifically with her. The final years brought deaths, not just of old friends, but of the generation that had defined the reign. Philip of Spain died in 1598, which was a strange kind of ending. The great opponent who had sent the Armada against her, and who had been, in another life, her brother-in-law dying before she did. The 9 Years' War in Ireland ground on toward its conclusion without any elegance or triumph. Robert Cecil, small and brilliant and the son of the great Cecil, managed the machinery of government with considerable skill, and managed the Queen with considerable diplomacy. She was not easy to manage in these years. She was sometimes difficult, sometimes erratic, sometimes seized by fits of dark humour or dark silence that her ladies struggled to lift. She stayed in her chair at Windsor and refused to move for days at a time. She was told by her physicians that she ought to go to bed and refused. A contemporary account describes her in 1599 as very melancholy, her face the picture of winter. The phrase is probably exaggerated by the reporter's access to rhetorical flourish, but the underlying observation seems to be sound. She was withdrawing slowly from the full engagement with public life that had characterized her for so long, She did not stop being queen. That is the remarkable thing. Even in the last years, she was reading documents, receiving ambassadors, making decisions. The machinery of government ran because she was still running it, or still authorizing it to run. Her grip was not absolute in the way it had been in the middle decades of the reign, when she was present at everything. But it had not dissolved either. She visited her court in these years with a kind of intensity, as though she was trying to hold on to the texture of the life she had lived in it. She demanded company. She stayed up late. She refused to be treated as old or diminished. When a younger woman at court made the mistake of saying something condescending about the Queen's age, the rebuke was sharp enough to be remembered. She had lost everyone. This is a fact that accumulates weight as you follow the final years of the reign. Cat Ashley, who had been her governess and her friend and the mother substitute for the mother she never knew. Mary Sidney, who had nursed her through smallpox in 1562, and whose own face had been badly scarred by the same illness. Dudley, Walsingham, Cecil, Essex. The generation was gone. What was left was England. England and the image and the commitment she had made to both, years ago, when she had told her parliament that she was already married and the ring on her finger was England's ring. She had kept that promise. It had cost her things. It had given her things. In the long twilight of the reign, the accounting of what it had been worth was becoming possible for the first time. The last days, Elizabeth died on the 24th of March, 1603 at Richmond Palace in the early hours of the morning. She was 69 years old. She had been queen for 45 years and approximately 4 months. She was the last of the Tudors. The decline that led to her death had been apparent from the autumn of 1602. She was physically weakened by a succession of minor illnesses and by the deeper wearing of age. She caught a serious cold or respiratory infection in the winter months, which settled on a constitution already strained by years and would not lift. She became profoundly melancholy, which was noted by her ladies and by the council with the specific kind of anxiety that surrounds an elderly monarch with no named successor. The question of the succession had been the unanswered question of the entire reign, and now, at the very end, with the Queen clearly dying, it was the most urgent question in England. Elizabeth had refused throughout her reign to name a successor, with a consistency that had frustrated everyone around her for 45 years. Her refusal was rooted in the same instinct that had governed so much of her political behaviour, a refusal to commit to anything that could not be uncommitted, a recognition that naming her successor would immediately create a rival court organised around the named heir. But Robert Cecil had long since made the necessary arrangements. The correspondence with James VI of Scotland had been ongoing for months, establishing the understanding that James would be acknowledged as Elizabeth's successor when the time came. The transition had been planned in everything except the formal announcement, which Elizabeth's continued failure to name James had made impossible, but which Cecil was perfectly prepared to make on his own authority the moment the Queen was dead. Elizabeth's last weeks were dark. She stopped eating, or nearly stopped. She refused to go to bed for extended periods, sitting on cushions on the floor of her chamber, silent and still. When her council urged her to go to her bed, she reportedly told them that if they could cure her of a weakness of the heart, she would willingly go to bed. The weakness of the heart sounds medical. It also sounds like something else. There is an account, possibly apocryphal, of her council asking her to confirm who should succeed her, and her indicating, with a gesture since she had lost the power of clear speech by this point, that they should send for James, or that a king should follow her, or some such thing that was interpreted as indicating James. The interpretation was probably correct and was certainly convenient. Archbishop Whitgift, who had been her last great prelate and who she seems to have found comforting, sat with her and prayed. She died sometime after 2 in the morning on the 24th of March. It was said that she died quietly, as her life had not always been quiet, in the early hours of a spring morning when the world outside the palace was still cold and dark. Robert Cecil announced her death to the waiting councillors. Then he announced the succession of James VI of Scotland as James I of England. The proclamation went out within hours. London received the news of the Queen's death and the new King's accession, with a reception that combined genuine grief for Elizabeth with the relief of a people who had been waiting for years for the succession question to resolve itself without catastrophe. James rode south from Edinburgh to claim his kingdom. He entered London to a welcome that was enthusiastic, if not quite as emotionally specific as the welcomes Elizabeth had received in her great years. He was the right person in a dynastic and political sense. He was a stranger in a specific and human sense, a Scotsman arriving in a country that had organised its entire sense of identity around a particular woman for nearly half a century. Elizabeth's body was taken by river to Whitehall and then to Westminster, where she lay in state. The funeral cortege that moved through London to Westminster Abbey drew crowds whose reaction is described as loud with weeping, which may be conventional language or may accurately describe the emotional reality of a population losing the only monarch most of them had ever known. She had been queen for 45 years. People in their 50s had lived their entire conscious lives under Elizabeth. The change was real and was felt. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, in the same vault as her sister Mary, which is one of the more poignant coincidences of Tudor history. The two daughters of Henry VIII lying together in the church they had disagreed so profoundly about how to use. Her effigy on the tomb shows her as she had appeared in life, or rather as she had appeared in the later portraits, regal, composed, ageless. The gap between the woman who died on those cushions and the monument constructed over her grave is very large, but that gap is also very Elizabethan. James eventually had her moved and re-entombed in a more elaborate setting, and he placed his mother Mary Queen of Scots in the tomb opposite, which means that Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots have been lying on opposite sides of Henry VII's chapel in Westminster Abbey for 4 centuries. There is a quality to this arrangement that history sometimes achieves, a darkly neat balancing of accounts, a final adjacency for two women whose relationship had been defined by distance and danger, and the impossibility of meeting on any but the most fatal terms. She left no children. The Tudor dynasty ended with her. The world she'd made, the England she had shaped across 45 years of extraordinary and exhausting and brilliant and occasionally terrible effort, passed to a Scottish king who would struggle to understand it and would eventually produce the conditions for the civil war that tore his son's reign apart. The Elizabethan world did not outlast her by very long, not in its essential character. But she had made it. It had existed, and it had been remarkable. The legacy, what she left behind. What do we do with Elizabeth I 4 centuries later? The question is not simple, and the simplest versions of the answer are not the most honest ones. The nationalist version, which runs through centuries of English and British history, and which reached its fullest expression in the Victorian era, when Elizabeth became a particular kind of mirror for the imperial project, holds that she was the maker of modern England, the founder of the Protestant nation, the inaugurator of empire, the genius who steered her kingdom through the storms of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, and emerged into the sunlit uplands of the Elizabethan Golden Age. This version is not entirely wrong, but it is curated. It keeps Ireland out of frame. It softens the investment in the slave trade. It makes the religious settlement look like tolerance when it was partly coercion. It makes the reign look more directed and more intentional than it felt from the inside, where most of what happened was improvisation under pressure. The feminist version, which emerged more fully in the 20th century and which is not wrong either, holds that Elizabeth was extraordinary precisely because of what she achieved as a woman in a world organised to prevent women from achieving what she achieved. She governed a major European state for 45 years. She commanded armies, conducted diplomacy, managed parliament, patronised arts and learning, navigated a succession of crises that would have destroyed lesser rulers of either gender, and did all of it in a context where the dominant ideology insisted she was inherently unfit for the task. This is genuinely impressive. Her ability to work within the constraints of her situation while simultaneously bending those constraints where she could is a real intellectual and political achievement. But the feminist version also has its complications. Elizabeth herself was not a feminist in any modern sense of the word. She did not advocate for other women. She did not challenge the fundamental premise that women were naturally subordinate. She made exceptions for herself while leaving the general principle intact. She could be cruel to the women around her, especially younger, more attractive women whose appeal threatened to redirect the attention of the men in her court. The treatment of Lettice Knollys after Dudley's marriage was not sisterly. The treatment of various ladies in waiting who had the temerity to marry without her permission was not sisterly. Elizabeth's gender exceptionalism was for herself, not a general principle. The revisionist version, which has been gathering force in recent decades, points to the failures and the costs and insists that the golden image needs tarnishing. Ireland, the slave trade, the persecution of Catholics, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, the Essex Rebellion handled too late because of Elizabeth's personal attachment to its leader, the refusal to name a successor that kept England in a state of latent constitutional crisis for 4 decades, These are real failures, and real costs, and honest history requires their acknowledgement. And then there is the personal, which does not fit neatly into any of these versions. A woman who kept her dead lover's last letter beside her bed for 15 years. Who cried when she signed the death warrant of someone she had loved. Who danced alone in her apartments in her old age, perhaps for herself, perhaps for the memory of a court that had been. Who said near the very end that she had lived and reigned so long that her people had grown weary of her. She was probably wrong about that last part, or at least not entirely right. But the fact that she believed it tells you something about the inner life of a woman who had been performing strength for so long that she had lost easy access to the vulnerability underneath. What did she leave behind? In the most direct political sense, she left behind a Protestant England, a functioning administrative system, a navy capable of projecting power, and a succession crisis that resolved itself more smoothly than anyone had a right to expect. She left behind, more durably, a literary culture that had been energized by the particular conditions of her court and her city, and that was still producing its greatest work in the months after her death. Shakespeare wrote Othello and King Lear and Macbeth after she was gone, but he wrote them in the English that her era had shaped and for audiences that her era had formed. She left behind the image, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the woman who had the heart of a king. The image has been remade in every subsequent century to serve the needs of the remakers. The Victorians made her an imperial proto-matriarch. The 20th century made her a feminist icon. The 21st century is still working out what to do with her, and the argument is productive because it is genuinely not settled. She also left behind something less tangible and harder to name, a way of being a person in an impossible situation, a method which was not a system exactly but a set of habits and instincts, for surviving and even thriving in a world organized to prevent your survival. She was not the first person to develop such a method. Her mother had tried and failed. But Elizabeth's method worked for 45 years, which is long enough to constitute a complete life's work. The method, if I had to summarize it, went something like this. Watch more than you speak. Speak less than you know. Never commit to anything you might need to uncommit to. Be more interested in being effective than in being admired. But be admired too, because admiration is also a tool. Hold the image and the person as separate things and manage both. Know your own mind, but don't always tell it. Be kind when kindness is possible. Be ruthless when ruthlessness is necessary. Never forget which is which. She was not a saint. She was not a monster. She was a human being of extraordinary intelligence and resilience, who found herself in one of the most complex and demanding roles available to a human being in the 16th century, and who performed that role for 45 years with a consistency and a general effectiveness that commands genuine admiration, even from those who acknowledge the failures. She died in Richmond in the early hours of the 24th of March 1603, and the world that had organised itself around her for nearly half a century began, slowly, to reorganise itself around someone else. James came from Scotland. The new Stuart century began. Elizabeth receded with extraordinary speed from present to past, from person to legend. But the legend is rich because the person was real. The myth persists because the history justifies it, or justifies enough of it to sustain the fascination. 4 centuries after her death, Elizabeth I is still one of the most written about, most debated, most examined figures in English history. We are still arguing about what she was and what she meant and how to evaluate what she did. The argument is the tribute she was worth arguing about, and so the story ends, as all the great ones do, not with a conclusion that ties everything together neatly, but with a woman in a room in the early hours of the morning, the long work done, the long performance finally over, the silence settling, the candles burning down. She had been many things. A red-haired child in a world that wanted her to be something else. A student who learned that the mind is the one thing that cannot be taken away. A prisoner in the tower who sat on wet stairs and refused briefly to go further. A queen who told her people she had the heart of a king. A woman who kept a letter in a box beside her bed. She had been Queen of England for 45 years. She had refused to be ruled by anyone but herself, and in that refusal she had built something that lasted. The letter in the box, his last letter, her own handwriting on the outside. That is where I choose to leave her, not in the formal portrait with the pearls and the allegory and the eternal youth, but in the quiet room, with the letter and the memory of a person she had loved who had gone first. Now the story has been told, the candles are low, the night is deep. Whatever you are carrying with you into sleep tonight, set it down gently. Elizabeth set down 45 years, You can put down whatever you have. The lights are going out now, one by one. Good night.